Welcome, dear traveller of late-night history, to a quiet corner of the world where the lights are soft, the noise is far away, and every story is told slowly enough for your mind to rest. Tonight, you will hear the entire journey of Alexander the Great, a tale that begins with a curious boy looking toward distant hills and ends with an empire stretched across continents, carried by courage, ambition, mistakes, friendships, and the quiet human fears. In this video, I promise you something gentle and rare, a story so steady and calming that you can relax, breathe deeper, and drift through 20 chapters of history without ever feeling lost. You will hear about his early dreams, his battles, his regrets, his victories, and the soft shadows that followed him into his final days. You will meet kings, generals, rebels, and I give you this promise. If you stay with me until the very end, you will not only understand Alexander's life more clearly, you will feel it quietly, as if you had walked beside him on those long, dusty roads. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gentle. Where are you right now? What time is it in your corner of the night? Are you listening from your bed, your desk, your couch, or somewhere between waking and dreaming? However you're not, if you enjoy slow, soothing journeys through history like this, you can help this channel grow by gently tapping the like button and subscribing. It tells the YouTube wins to carry these stories to more quiet souls who need them. And here is your hook for tonight. By the time the final chapter arrives, you will discover the last quiet truth that Alexander himself could not outrun. A truth about limits, about dreams, and about why even the greatest names in history fade. Stay with me, settle in, and let the story guide you like a calm river through the night. You are now listening to part 1 of this long, gentle journey, the part where we return to the very first days of a boy in a distant land. This part will talk about his birthplace, the quiet city around him, and the early signs that his path would stretch far beyond its walls. Far in the north of ancient Greece stood a small city called Pella, a place of stone. In the evenings, smoke rose from cooking fires, voices slowly faded, and the town sank into a calm, familiar darkness. For almost everyone there, tomorrow would look much like today, but in one house near the palace, a new life had just begun. In that house, a newborn child rested in his mother's arms. His eyes were dark and still learning to focus. His hands opened and closed in the air. His universe was warmth against his skin, gentle arms around him, and the steady rise and fall of soft voices near his cradle. To his parents, he was already precious. To the wider world, he did not yet exist at all. His father was a king, hardened by years of war and restless plans. His mother was proud and intense, certain that unseen powers watched over her son. They wished for strength in him, but inside the boy, in these first quiet days, something simpler began to grow, a steady wish to reach out toward the world rather than hide from it. As the seasons turned, the child's world widened. At first, he noticed only light and shadow shifting across the ceiling, the chill of morning air, the comfort of a blanket, the smell of bread from the kitchen. Then he began to recognize footsteps in the corridor. The circle of his awareness slowly expanded from cradle to room, from room to hallway, from hallway to courtyard and sky. He watched everything more carefully than most children, holding sights and sounds in his mind, as if he were quietly collecting them. At night he also felt fear. Wind slipped through small gaps and made strange whispers in wood and stone. Shadows stretched across the walls and changed shape. In those moments the room felt unfamiliar, and he pulled the covers close, wishing the world would grow small and simple again. Yet even fear carried a question. What lay beyond the safe rooms he knew? Beyond the courtyards, beyond the dark line of hills he had glimpsed from a high window? Did the world end where the eye could no longer see, or did it continue into places no one around him had ever walked? That question made him uneasy and excited. One wished to stay close to his mother's voice, the familiar smells, and the safe routine of each day. The other wished to follow the road out of Pella and find the answer to that distant question. He did not yet know words like fate or destiny, but the first quiet outline of such an idea was already there. Around him, adults moved under their own shadows. The messengers arrived with dust on their cloaks and serious news in their hands. The boy did not grasp their language, but he understood the change in the air. Voices dropped, steps quickened, and his father's face grew more set and heavy. From this he learned, without being told, that the world outside Pella was full of danger, as older servants told him bedtime stories of heroes, travellers, and patient queens, speaking slowly so that each image had time to settle in his mind. Old soldiers let him touch a shield or hold a light wooden sword, showing him how to stand with his feet firm on the ground and breathe steadily. Tutors arrived with small tablets and wax. Through their lessons, he discovered that there were lands he had never seen, rivers he had never crossed, and cities with names that sounded like distant music. The world beyond Pella grew larger in his thoughts each day. Sometimes at dusk, he would stand where he could see the hills outside the city. The sky above them turned from gold to deep blue. Then slowly, he only felt, in a way too quiet for others to notice, that the road beyond Pella might somehow be meant for him. And so his beginning passed like a long, slow breath. Soon, in the next part of this story, we will step closer to the family that argued and planned around him, to the teachers who waited with their scripts. You are now listening to part 2. In this part, we will talk about Alexander's childhood within the Macedonian royal family, the quiet pressures that shaped him, and the early wishes that slowly formed in his heart. In the big stone palace of Pella, mornings often began before the sun. Servants moved softly through the corridors, lamps flickered, the smell of warm bread drifted from the kitchens. And somewhere inside those long hallways, a young boy with curious eyes was already awake, listening. He was still growing, still small compared to the great warriors who trained in the courtyard, but his steps were quicker now, his gaze sharper, his mind more awake to the world around him. He belonged to a royal family, yet he felt like a quiet observer in his own home. His father, King Philip II, was a man shaped by war and heavy responsibility. When he walked, the sound of his boots echoed against stone like short thunder. His voice filled rooms. He loved his son, yet his love was tough, often hidden beneath strict words and high expectations. Philip wanted a successor who would be strong enough to unite the Greek world, wise enough to hold it together, and brave enough to lead men into lands they had never seen. His mother, Olympias, was different, gentle at times, fierce at others. She believed the gods watched over her child. She whispered stories of him. When she looked at her son, her eyes softened as if she saw something in him others could not yet understand. But inside her softness lived stormy pride. She often reminded him that he was born for something greater than the quiet rooms of Pella. Growing up between these two strong spirits was not easy. Alexander wanted his father's praise. In those tensions, his first inner struggles began to take shape. He wished to be great, truly great, yet he feared he might never reach the very high place his parents imagined for him. Some evenings, lying alone in his bed, he wondered whether greatness was a gift one was born with, or a mountain one had to climb, slowly and painfully. Still, childhood breathed through him. When a cool breeze swept across the courtyard, he would stop, tilt his face toward the hills, and breathe deeply. as if the wind carried stories he was meant to hear. But there were other days when the palace felt heavy. Arguments whispered behind closed doors. Courtiers bowed too quickly and spoke too carefully. Alexander noticed everything. When voices rose, many resisted, and those arguments spilled into the palace like slow-moving shadows. Alexander was still a boy, but his heart carried a quiet hope. He wanted to understand the world, not just rule it. He wanted to see the land spoken of in stories, to touch new rivers, to know new peoples. He wished, not loudly, but deeply, that there was more to life than inherited crowns and endless war. He sometimes feared he was too small, too soft-spoken, too thoughtful to become the warrior king his father wanted. When Philip returned from battle covered in dust and triumph, Alexander admired him greatly, but he also felt a small ache. Would he ever be strong enough to walk beside such a man? These emotions, the hope, the doubt, formed his first inner barrier. Even when no one pressured, his mother said the gods lived among them. His tutors said the stars were distant fires in the heavens. But to Alexander, they were simply reminders of how very wide the world was, and how far he still had to go. Beyond these inner struggles, the outside world also pressed on his childhood. Macedon had enemies on every border. Illyrians in the north, Thracians in the east, Greeks who disliked Macedonian power in the south. Sometimes news arrived. Guards paced more quickly. Everyone grew more alert. Alexander learned early that peace was fragile, like a pot of clay that could crack with a single careless touch. But he did not face this world alone. Several figures supported him, guiding him from confusion toward purpose. One was Leonidas, a stern relative assigned to oversee Alexander's upbringing. Leonidas insisted the boy run long distances, eat simple meals, and sleep on. Something in him knew discipline had its place. Another guide was Lysimachus, who taught him with gentler methods. They would sit under trees while he acted out scenes from old myths, sometimes calling Alexander Little Achilles. Through these stories, Alexander began to understand bravery, not as loud shouting or blind courage, but as quiet devotion to a goal. And then came Aristotle, but his lessons would belong to another chapter, still waiting in the distance. For now, Alexander's days continued in patterns of training, studying, observing, and wondering. He practiced with a small wooden sword, learned the first shapes of letters, listened to the hum of political tension around him, and tried to imagine a future that was still only a foggy outline. One afternoon, while walking, their hooves struck the earth in steady beats. Their breath rose in soft clouds. Among them stood a dark horse, wild-eyed, restless, refusing every handler who tried to touch him. The men cursed under their breath. The horse tossed its head angrily. Alexander watched from a distance, unaware that this moment would stay with him for years. He felt something stir inside him, curiosity, challenge, but the sight of that wild horse carved itself into his memory like a quiet promise. His childhood was a gentle but restless river, moving, learning, growing. Each day softened him in some ways and sharpened him in others. And slowly his wish began to form more clearly. He wanted to be someone who walked toward the unknown, not away from it. As this part of our story closes, imagine the young boy standing once again at a high window in Pella. The hills turn dark, and far beyond them lies a world waiting for him, though he does not yet know how soon it will call his name. In the next part, we will follow him into the presence of the man who would shape his mind more deeply than ever. You are now listening to part 3. In this part, we quietly follow young Alexander into the presence of Aristotle, the teacher whose calm lessons would shape his mind, his questions, and the quiet fire inside him. When Alexander reached the early years of his youth, he felt as if he was standing at the edge of a wide field. The palace at Pella hummed every day with footsteps, whispers of politics, and the clatter of weapons from the training yards. Yet inside his mind, he often felt alone, searching for something he could not name. Then, on a gentle morning, when the shadows were still long on the ground, a new figure arrived, a man. Instead, he carried a small scroll tucked under his arm, a calm gaze and a quiet presence that immediately changed the air around him. This was Aristotle. Alexander had heard only a few things about him: that he was wise beyond measure, that he had travelled far, and that he understood the world with a depth few could dream of. But hearing about a man and standing before him were two different things. When Aristotle entered the room, Aristotle did not bow, nor make a grand speech. He simply looked at the boy and asked softly, "Tell me, Alexander, what is the thing you most wish to understand in this world?" The question startled him. No teacher had ever begun a lesson by asking what he wanted. Alexander felt many answers swelling in his chest: that he wished to be strong like his father, admired like the heroes of old, free. Yet something deeper rose instead, something so simple he almost hesitated to speak it. "I want to know how big the world truly is," he said. Aristotle smiled, not widely, but warmly, enough for Alexander to feel the approval. It was the first lesson. The curiosity was a door, and he had already placed his hand on its handle. The early lessons did not take place inside the palace walls. Aristotle led Alexander outside, beneath a broad tree. There he picked up a small stone, rough and unremarkable, and placed it in Alexander's palm. "Close your eyes," he said gently. "Feel it. Let it tell you its story." Alexander obeyed. At first he felt only the cool surface, the weight, the hardness, but as he focused, he felt something else: an ancient stillness, a hint of mountains, rivers, sunlight, and storms that had shaped it. When he opened his eyes, Aristotle's lessons continued in this quiet manner, each one unfolding like a slow-moving stream. He taught Alexander about the shape of the earth, about stars that guided travellers at night, about plants that healed, about cities beyond the sea, and about the different peoples of the world, their hopes, fears, and dreams. One phrase Aristotle repeated often stayed with Alexander: to lead men, you must first understand them, and to understand them, you must first learn to see through their eyes. This idea planted a deep longing in Alexander, not only to travel, but to truly know every place he touched. Yet the more he learned, the more a new kind of struggle grew inside him. His father Philip valued strength, speed, and victory. Aristotle taught the value of patience, understanding, and thought. Alexander felt torn between two futures, one shaped by the sword. Some nights, while the palace slept, he sat near his window with his knees drawn close, wondering if a king could ever be both a fierce warrior and a thoughtful student of the world. While these inner questions slowly circled his heart, trouble continued to stir beyond Pella's walls. The Thracians caused unrest. Greek cities murmured against Macedon. Messengers came and went at all. But through all of this, Aristotle remained a steady, guiding light. One afternoon, he placed a book in Alexander's hands, an epic about Achilles. The boy read it slowly, absorbing each word, each image of bravery, anger, loyalty, and loss. He felt as though he were looking into a distant mirror, seeing someone he admired, but also feared becoming. From Achilles he learned something. After that, Alexander began practicing patience, breathing slowly before reacting, thinking before speaking, a skill harder than swinging a sword, but far more powerful. Aristotle shaped him not with strict orders, but with gentle questions. He asked Alexander to consider why people fought, why they loved, why they feared, why they dreamed. He taught these teachings settled into Alexander like stones forming the foundation of a great future road. As months passed, the boy grew in ways no one could see at first. His shoulders remained slender, his height only slightly changed, but his thoughts deepened. His questions he began to imagine lands beyond the hills, lands with rivers wider than anything in Macedon, cities with towers tall enough to touch the sky, and people whose languages sounded like songs carried by the wind. One evening, as the sun melted into soft orange light, Aristotle ended a lesson with words that Alexander would remember for the rest of his life. One day, the world will open its gates for you. But remember, Alexander, those who guide, they are the ones who understand it most deeply. That night, Alexander stood by his window again. The stars blinked softly above him. For the first time, he felt the path of his life stretching forward, not clear, not easy, but waiting. And somewhere in that vast distance, he sensed the next turning point approaching, the moment he would stand before a wild, untamed horse named. You are now listening to part 4. In this part, we will quietly follow the day Alexander met the wild horse Persepolis, how fear and calm stood face to face, and how that moment opened a new path for both boy and animal. The sun was high over Pella, and the air was bright and sharp, the kind of day when every sound in the courtyard seemed louder than usual. Soldiers' armour clinked, boys shouted during practice, and the dust rose in. Alexander was still young. Not yet the man history would remember, but already his eyes watched everything with a calm attention that set him apart. That day, the king had invited nobles and guests to see a new horse brought to court. The animal was said to be strong, fast, and worthy of a king. Men spoke of it with excitement. He loved horses, loved their strength and grace, loved the way they seemed both powerful and gentle, like rivers that could rush or rest. As he stepped into the training field, he saw the horse at once. It was black, deep black, with a shining coat and wide, bright eyes. Its muscles were tense beneath its skin. Its ears flicked backward and forward, catching every sound. The men around it tugged, but the horse snorted, reared up, and struck the air with its front hooves, as if fighting with an enemy no one else could see. Alexander felt his heart squeeze. He did not feel fear, exactly. Instead, he felt a strange kind of sadness, because he could see that the animal was not truly wild in its soul, only overwhelmed. The horse wanted to run, but it did not trust the hands that held its rope. At the same time, Alexander, all his life so far, he had lived under the shadow of his father's greatness. Philip was a soldier, a king, a man of many victories. Alexander wished so deeply to show that he, too, carried something strong inside him. Yet he always wondered if he would ever find the right moment, the right way. Now, as he watched the black horse toss its head and refuse every handler, he felt a quiet, what if he failed in front of everyone, in front of his father, in front of the nobles who already thought he was too thoughtful, too gentle, too young? His stomach tightened as he pictured himself falling, being thrown in the dirt, hearing laughter around him. For a moment his feet wanted to stay where they were, safe at the edge of the scene. The outer world did not help his doubts. Men around the horse. Another struck the horse lightly, trying to bring it to heel. The animal only grew more afraid, eyes rolling, hooves scraping. Someone muttered that the horse was useless, that even a rich price had been wasted. King Philip watched with a disappointed look. Guests shook their heads. There was talk of sending the horse away, maybe even selling it far from Macedon. It seemed as if the day would end with frustration and loss. By his side, a few companions called his name softly, telling him not to go too near. They cared for him. They did not want to see him hurt. One older man, who had watched Alexander grow, whispered that this was not the time to take such a risk. But there was another kind of support too, calmer and quieter. Aristotle, standing at a distance, simply watched with thoughtful eyes. He did not now. Perhaps those lessons would move from the mind into the body. Aristotle's steady gaze was like a silent hand on Alexander's shoulder, reminding him that he was not alone inside himself. Alexander drew a slow breath and walked toward the horse. Dust rose around his sandals. The men handling the animal frowned, surprised. The king raised his eyebrows, but he noticed something important. Every time the horse turned, every time it jerked away, its fear grew stronger when its own shadow slid across the ground in front of it. The dark shape seemed to scare it as much as the noise of the crowd. Quietly, Alexander spoke, loud enough for his father to hear. He said the horse was not mad, only afraid of its own shadow. People around him scoffed, thinking that he asked his father to let him try. For a moment the king hesitated. There was danger here. Yet there was also a chance to test the courage and insight of his son. With a small motion of his hand, Philip gave permission, though his face stayed serious. Alexander took the reins, but he did not pull. Instead, he gently turned the horse so that its face pointed toward the sun. He stroked its neck, speaking in a low, soothing voice. Words meant not just for the animal's ears, but for its heart. The horse trembled, but did not rear. Step by step, Alexander led it in a small circle, still talking softly, still keeping its shadow behind. Trust began to bloom, slow and fragile. The courtyard grew quieter. Men who had tried and failed now watched with wide eyes, wondering if what they saw was real. With one smooth movement, Alexander placed a foot in the stirrup and swung himself onto the horse's back. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. The horse leaped forward, full of energy, but Alexander leaned into its motion, not fighting, only guiding. Together they moved across the field, not as enemies but as partners who had finally understood one another. Hooves beat a steady rhythm. He felt no fear now, only a deep joy, a sense that he had entered a space meant specifically for him. The horse, too, seemed to discover something new, that this light weight on its back was not a burden, but a companion. When they finally slowed and returned, dust settling around them like a soft curtain, the courtyard burst into amazed voices. King Philip, moved in a way he could not fully hide, whether those exact words were spoken or not. The meaning was clear. On that day, Alexander had stepped out of childhood in his father's eyes. For Alexander himself, the moment left a long, gentle echo. He had faced an outer danger and an inner doubt at the same time. He had listened to what Aristotle had taught him about watching carefully, about understanding nature instead of trying to, and he had gained not only a horse, but a true companion, Persepolis, who from that day would carry him across many lands. As night fell over, Pella and the stars rose one by one above the hills. Alexander may have thought of the wild eyes that had slowly grown calm under his hand, and of how the world itself might one day be like that horse. In the next part, we will move forward with him as his father's shadow grows longer, as dangers gather both outside and inside the kingdom, and as whispers of change begin to stir like distant thunder beyond the peaceful Macedonian sky. You are now listening to part 5. In this part, we will follow the quiet, uneasy days before Alexander became king, the inner struggles between him and his father, the shadows of plots growing in the palace, and finally the soft, heavy night when King Philip fell and the world shifted around Alexander forever. After the day with Bucephalus, Alexander walked through Pella with a new... He had proven something important to everyone, including himself, yet the palace around him did not grow calmer. Instead, it slowly filled with new tensions, like a sky turning darker, though no storm had broken yet. King Philip was planning more than just the safety of Macedon now. His eyes were fixed on a greater dream: to lead all of Greece in a grand campaign against the Persian Empire. His halls, envoys came and went, bearing messages from distant cities, each with its own fears and hopes. Alexander, still young, but no longer a child, watched all of this with a mind sharpened by Aristotle and a heart shaped by the constant presence of danger. In his own quiet way, he longed not only to be included, but to stand in harmony with his father. Yet inside him, a different wish struggled. He wanted to be recognized as his own person, not just as Philip's son, not just as a shadow following behind a taller figure. This inner desire sometimes made him restless, pacing his chambers at night while others slept, wondering what his place truly was in the long, unfolding story around him. Their relationship, always complex, began to feel more... He arranged new marriages to strengthen alliances, decisions that did not always sit well with Alexander or with his mother Olympias. There were feasts where wine flowed, where words slipped loose from careful tongues and drifted across the hall like small sharp arrows. Once during such a gathering, a drunken remark about Philip's new marriage and the legitimacy of his heirs cut deeply into Alexander's heart. His father, also stirred by wine and wounded pride, clashed with him in words that echoed in the hall. For a brief moment it seemed as though the gap between them would never close. Afterward, when the hall was empty and only the faint smell of spilled wine remained, Alexander sat alone and replayed those words in his mind. He loved his father. He admired his strength and his skill. His desire to be worthy, to be trusted, pulled one way. His pain at being doubted pulled another. This was the inner barrier he faced now, not on the battlefield, but inside his own chest. Outside himself, the world was no kinder. The more powerful Philip became, the more enemies he gathered, not just among foreign tribes, but within the tangle of Greek politics, and even among his own companions. Some feared his growing might. Others envied his position. A passing servant might hear a name spoken too softly, a plan hinted at, a grudge remembered. Alexander, who had always been attentive to the mood of the palace, felt those whispers like a chill wind sneaking under the door. He did not know every detail, but he understood that greatness often walked closely beside danger. Yet he was not without support. His mother, fierce and protective, reminded him often that he had a special destiny. Sometimes her words felt like comfort, other times they sounded like a warning. Aristotle's teachings still lived in his mind as well, even if the philosopher was no longer always by his side. Alexander remembered lessons about human nature, about how ambition and fear could twist people's hearts. Old generals, loyal to Philip, but increasingly respectful of Alexander's abilities, sometimes shared quiet advice. These were his allies, his guiding voices during days when nothing felt certain. Slowly, the story moved toward a single night that no one could see clearly in advance, yet many had unknowingly been walking toward. Philip prepared for a grand celebration, a festival that would show the strength of his kingdom and the unity of his allies. Guests gathered from near and far. Plans for the campaign against Persia were at their peak. The air was thick with the promise of a great future, but in the corners where torches did not fully reach, the shadows were deep, and in those shadows, old grudges stirred. Alexander, during that time, felt like someone standing between two worlds. On one side stood the world shaped by his father's will, ordered by Philip's victories and careful alliances. He had reconciled, at least on the surface, with his father after their quarrels. They spoke of the coming campaign. Philip's tone toward him sometimes softened, sometimes sharpened, but there was a sense that the next chapter of both their lives would be written on distant soil, under a foreign sun. No one knew that fate had chosen a closer place, a nearer night. When that night came, it began like many others of celebration. People laughed and drank, speaking of war and glory and long journeys ahead. Alexander was present, his face composed, but his mind active as ever, weighing every look, every word. Yet beneath all the noise lay a thin, hidden thread of tension. Among the crowd moved a man carrying more than just his own thoughts. In his heart lived anger and resentment, sharpened over time into something deadly. But in one brief, terrible moment, action burst from that hidden place. King Philip was struck down. There was shock before there were screams, disbelief before movement. Torches wavered as people turned, some running, some freezing where they stood. For a few heartbeats, time seemed to hesitate, as if the world itself could not decide what to do next. In the centre of that, he had feared many things: disappointment, exile, being overshadowed forever. But he had not truly imagined this, that the great figure who had filled so much of his sky could vanish so suddenly, leaving behind no voice, no footsteps, only silence and echoes. In the hours that followed, confusion and sorrow swirled together. Some wept, some whispered, some were already Alexander, beneath the weight of shock and grief, had to remember everything he had ever learned about calm, about understanding, about strength that did not shout. He felt pain for his father, complicated though their bond had been. He felt the heavy pull of duty, like a cloak suddenly placed on his shoulders. And somewhere in the quiet centre of himself, he knew that this, as dawn slowly approached and the first pale light touched the walls of Pella, the boy who had once watched the hills and wondered how far the world stretched now faced a different question. Not how big the world was, but whether he was ready to stand at its centre. In the next part, we will walk beside him through those first uncertain steps as a young king at dawn, surrounded by grief, suspicion, and expectation. You are now listening to part 6. In this part, we will stay beside Alexander in the first pale hours after his father's death, when he must choose between sinking into grief as a son or standing up as a king. And we will see how his quiet wishes, hidden fears, enemies and loyal allies shape his first steps onto a restless throne. The night of Philip's death seemed to refuse an ending. Torches burned low. Servants spoke in whispers, as if any loud sound might break something fragile in the air. In a dim room, away from the noise, Alexander sat awake, shoulders stiff, hands loosely clasped before him. His eyes were tired and red, not only from tears but from thinking too long without rest. He had lost his father, and whatever hard words had passed between them, that loss cut deep. Yet behind the sadness, another truth pressed on him. Death did not wait, but neither did power. Macedon was like a great horse without a rider, nervous, ready to bolt. If he did not reach for the reins, someone else would. Deep inside, a wish rose with surprising clarity. He did not just want the crown to shine on his head. He wanted the chance to hold together what Philip had built, to steady the kingdom, to carry their shared dream of leading Greece into the wider world. Could he truly guide men older and harder than himself? Could he command respect in halls full of clever, hungry nobles? The questions circled him like slow birds in the grey light. He remembered Philip's lessons, sharp and unforgiving, and the rare moments of pride in his father's eyes. He wondered whether Philip had really believed in his. In other corners of the palace, nobles met in small groups, their faces half lit by oil lamps. Some were loyal, some were unsure, some were already thinking of which side might profit them most. There were men with drops of royal blood who might, in the confusion, try to claim the throne. In the Greek cities, certain leaders who had always hated Macedonian rule would now whisper that the time had come to break free. Alexander could almost hear those whispers, even from far away. His grief urged him to stay still, to remain by his father's body as a simple son. Duty pulled him toward the door, toward council rooms and harsh decisions. He stood between those two desires, feeling like a man with one foot on each side of a growing crack. In that moment, voices around him began to take shape. His mother, Olympias, fierce as ever, came to him not in soft comfort, but in burning. Her words were hard, almost like orders, but they gave him something to lean on, the sense that his life had a direction, even if he could not yet see its end. Some of Philip's most trusted generals came as well. They had watched Alexander ride beside them in battle, had seen his courage, his quick choices, his calm under danger. When they knelt or bowed to Alexander, offering their loyalty, it was not to a child, but to a leader they had quietly measured for years. Their support settled around him like a firm hand on his back, steadying him when doubt pushed. Alexander also reached inward toward lessons that had no shape anyone else could see. Aristotle's teachings. He remembered that true power was not only force and fear, but understanding, timing, and clear sight. If he let wild pride rule him, he would make careless enemies. So he chose a narrow path between them, telling himself that each step had to be thought through but not delayed. The first hours of his rule were not bright with ceremony. They were quiet and sharp. He met important nobles and commanders in small rooms, speaking in a level voice, asking direct questions, listening more than he spoke. He made it clear. Men who gave honest support, he reassured with promises of stability and shared glory. Men whose eyes slid away, whose voices carried hidden sharpness, he marked in his mind. Some dangerous rivals, those most likely to tear the royal family into pieces, were quickly pushed out of reach of power. With his core circle steadied, he turned to the army. The soldiers were the true weight behind any crown in Macedon. He stood before them. He spoke simply of Philip's greatness, of the road that had been opened but not yet walked to its end, of dust, hunger, and danger shared on campaign. Then he spoke of himself, not boasting, but reminding them of battles where he had led charges, of wounds he had taken beside them. He told them that the dream of marching beyond Greece did not die with his father. If they would stand with him, it could still live. Their answer rose like a single sound, rough and full. That roar of loyalty wrapped around him like armour he could not touch, but could feel. Outside Macedon, unrest still stirred. Reports came of city-states in Greece testing their chains, of distant tribes watching the border more boldly, of rumours that Alexander was too young to hold what Philip had seized. He could not answer every threat at once, but he understood that he must move quickly against the most dangerous. The time for deep mourning. When morning finally spread across Pella and the first clear light touched the palace stones, Alexander stepped out to look at his land. The hills he had watched as a boy were the same, but his place beneath the sky had changed. He was no longer the son, wondering how far the world stretched. He was the king who would have to push that line outward or see it pulled back. He did not know exactly how the coming. In the next part, we will follow him as he turns from the safety of the palace toward the restless edges of his kingdom, facing rebellions, old enemies, and the hard work of forcing Greece and Macedon into one steady base, before he can even dream. You are now listening to part 7. In this part, we will stay close to Alexander as he leaves the safety of the palace to face rebellions on his borders, restless Greek cities, old enemies who test a young king, and we will see how he turns fear and doubt into firm, quiet action to secure his base before dreaming of Persia. When the first urgent messages arrived, they did not come as a surprise. Somewhere deep inside, Alexander had been waiting. A young king, no matter how brave or clever, is like a newly built bridge. Everyone wants to see if it will hold. From the north came word that the tribes beyond Macedon were moving, testing the borders. From the south came rumours that Greek cities, especially proud ones like Thebes and Athens, were whispering of freedom, thinking that without Philip, Macedon's grip had weakened. Each report, yet within Alexander burned a simple, steady wish. He wanted to prove that the kingdom had not just survived Philip's death, but remained strong enough to complete what his father had begun. He wanted Greece united, not by fear alone, but by the knowledge that Macedon had a leader who would not hesitate when challenged. This wish was not just about power. If the base behind him crumbled, any glory ahead would mean little. Still, wishing and doing were not the same, and inside himself he wrestled with quieter doubts that did not show on his face. In the privacy of his chambers, he sometimes asked whether his youth would make others underestimate him, whether his need to act quickly might lead him to act harshly, and whether the lessons of Aristotle about thought. These questions did not paralyze him, but they followed him like long shadows. Outside, dangers did not wait. Northern tribes gathered like storm clouds beyond the frontier, raiding, watching, hoping this new king would stay home and cling to his throne. In the south, Greek leaders measured the moment, some eager to break away from Macedonian influence, others afraid of being crushed if they misjudged the young ruler. Alexander knew that if he stayed still, the unrest would grow, and soon he would be surrounded by fires on every side. So he made a choice that blended courage with clarity. He would move first, and he would move fast. He did not ride into this challenge alone. Around him stood seasoned generals who had fought under Philip and now placed their trust in the son. Men like Parmenion, the Macedonian army, hardened by years of campaign, became his greatest support. They had shouted for him when he first spoke as king. Now they would follow him into battlefields that would test both them and their young leader. To them, he was not only the child of Philip, but the rider of Persepolis, the prince who would face danger without flinching. Their presence wrapped around him like a... Before marching, Alexander did something that showed both his practical mind and his deeper longing for meaning. He offered quiet sacrifices to the gods, asking not just for victory, but for the wisdom to choose the right path. He wanted to be more than a storm passing through the world. He wanted to leave behind a shape, a lasting form of order. Then the marches began. First, he turned north. The roads were rough, and sometimes no more than narrow tracks through hills and forests. The men moved in silence broken only by the creak of leather, the thud of boots, and the snorting of horses. Alexander rode at the front, not hidden behind others. Each mile was a small test of will, of endurance, and he felt the weight of every eye on his back. When they reached, he advanced directly, meeting the enemy with speed and precision. The battles themselves, though fierce, were not chaos in his mind. He saw lines and patterns, as if the battlefield were a board and he were arranging pieces on it. When he struck hard, breaking resistance quickly. The tribes who had hoped for a weak king instead found a commander willing to take risks, to climb difficult ground, to push his men and himself with unyielding determination. The northern danger was cut down and scattered. Yet even as celebrations flickered in the campfires at night, Alexander's thoughts turned south toward Greece. He knew that while he was fighting in the hills, news of his successes would travel, but so would questions about how far he was willing to go to keep Greece united. The greatest test waited there. He did not rest long. Turning his army around, he marched toward the Greeks. Some cities hesitated, unsure whether to rise or submit. Others watched silently, weighing the wind. When Thebes finally threw off Macedonian control, denying Alexander's authority, it became a symbol, a flame that could either be quietly put out or allowed to spread into a larger fire. As he approached Thebes, Alexander felt a deep tension inside. Part of him wished to give. Another part knew that if he appeared soft now, many others would follow Thebes' example, and the unity his father had built would dissolve like mist. His inner struggle was not about whether to act, but about how severe the lesson should be. At the walls of Thebes, words still had a chance. Some envoys and leaders might have hoped for a compromise, but the situation had moved beyond easy healing. The city had chosen a path of open defiance, and its choice challenged the very idea of Macedonian leadership over Greece. Alexander made his decision with a heavy but steady heart. The siege that followed was swift and decisive. Macedonian forces, trained and disciplined, pressed hard. Thebes resisted with courage, born of fear and pride, but the outcome slowly became clear. When the city finally fell, Alexander did not treat it. He allowed harsh punishment to fall upon Thebes, its walls broken, many of its people killed or sold, its proud name scarred deeply. It was a terrible act, and even in a bedtime story, we must let its weight be felt. Alexander did not rejoice in the destruction. In the quiet places of his mind, he knew that such severity would mark him forever. But he also knew that the message this act, the echo of Thebes' fall, rolled across Greece. City-states that had been uncertain now bent their heads. Some submitted out of fear, others out of respect for the clarity and strength Alexander had shown. To parties watching from afar, especially Persia, it became clear that Macedon was not broken by Philip's death, and that the new king was as dangerous. In the aftermath, as the dust of destroyed walls settled and the army turned away, Alexander must have felt both victory and sorrow. He had secured his base. Greece, though not loving him as one of their own, would march with him, or at least not rise behind him when he left. But he had also crossed a line. He had learned that to hold a great dream, under the night sky, far from the noise of battle, he might have remembered Aristotle's words about understanding people and consequences, and wondered how history would judge the sentence he had passed on Thebes. Still, the path ahead was now clear, in a way it had not been before. Macedon was steady. Greece was contained. The northern borders were quiet. The restless horse. In the next part, we will ride with him to the edge of the known world of his time, to the shores where the land of Greece ends and the sea road to Persia begins, as he gathers his forces and takes his first quiet steps toward the vast, unknown empire across the water. You are now listening to Part 8. In this part, we will walk beside Alexander as he quietly gathers his forces, turns his face away from the familiar hills of Macedon, and approaches the edge of the sea that separates his known world from the vast Persian Empire, carrying with him both bright dreams and heavy, unspoken fears. By the time the dust of Thebes had settled and the echoes of the name Persia had been in his ears since childhood, spoken in lessons, in councils, in the restless conversations of soldiers. It was not just a distant kingdom. It was an enormous tapestry of cities, rivers, mountains and peoples, bound together under a great king. For his father Philip, Persia had been a grand goal, a campaign planned carefully and never fully begun. For Alexander now, it was something more personal, a wide, unexplored horizon. His wish was clear in his heart. He wanted to lead an army across the water, to stand on foreign soil, not as a guest or raider, but as a challenger to the greatest power of his time. And yet, even as this desire shone steadily inside him, there was another movement, softer and more troubling beneath it. He sometimes asked himself in the long quiet of night whether he truly sought justice for past Persian invasions of Greece, or did he want to free Greek cities, or to carve his name across the map? These questions circled him like faint, persistent birds. They did not stop him, but they kept him honest with himself, a thin inner thread of doubt that prevented his dreams from becoming completely blind. Beyond his inner struggle, the outer world presented obstacles of its own. The Persian Empire was not a sleeping beast. Its kings had ruled for generations. Many would say that to march such a comparatively small army against such a wide land was reckless. There were also practical worries. The cost of moving men and horses across sea and shore, the danger of storms, the uncertainty of food, the risk that Greek cities behind him might still change their minds once he was far away. Alexander understood all this. He was around him, gathered commanders who had chosen to trust his vision. Parmenion and other seasoned officers gave advice shaped by years of experience. The Macedonian phalanx, with its long spears and disciplined ranks, formed the backbone of his army. Companion cavalry, men who had grown up beside him and ridden with him through earlier battles, now rode as the sharp edge of his power. There were also allied Greek forces. Together, they formed not just an army, but a walking city of tents, hopes, memories, and uncertain futures. Before he led them toward the coast, Alexander spent quiet time arranging matters at home, naming trusted officials to guard Macedon and watch Greece, making sure that the kingdom would not crack in his absence. It was like he knew that a grand campaign could be shattered by a single message from home if news arrived that everything behind him had fallen apart. Only when he felt these supports were as firm as he could make them did he allow himself to look fully toward the east. The journey to the coast was not rushed. The army moved in stages, crossing rivers, passing through familiar lands that began to... Alexander rode often near the front, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking with his officers, his eyes drifting not just over the men but beyond them, as if he were already seeing the distant shores in his mind. At night, campfires dotted the ground like small stars fallen from the sky. The murmurs of thousands of voices sank slowly into the dark. In his own tent, Alexander laid out maps by lantern light, tracing with his fingers the lines of coast and the rough shapes of Persian satrapies. The fire flickered, and the shadows of his hands moved over lands he had not yet seen. When at last they reached the edge of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, Alexander found himself standing on the threshold of everything. The waters shimmered under the changing sky, restless and deep. Behind him lay Macedon and Greece, the world he had known all his life. Before him lay Asia, huge and largely unknown, waiting with its own rivers and mountains and cities. For a quiet moment, even he, with all his courage, must have felt very small. Yet this smallness did not crush him. It seemed instead to call him forward, like a soft ships waited along the shore, ready to carry men and horses across the currents. The logistics were complex, and every officer had tasks to handle, but Alexander allowed himself one ceremonial gesture that belonged fully to his heart. According to later telling, he sailed to the coast of Asia and leapt to the shore, casting a spear into the soil, as if to mark the land as something he... Whether this moment happened exactly that way or not, the spirit behind it was real. He wanted his soldiers to feel that they were not just visiting, but beginning something permanent. Still, he was not careless with the past. He visited the ancient city of Troy, walking among ruins and memories of heroes he had loved in his readings. Standing where Achilles and other legendary figures had once, he was a real man, not a story, yet he could not help comparing the path before him to those old tales. In the quiet of those broken walls, with the wind sliding through empty spaces where voices once might have risen in song or battle cries, he may have whispered a vow to be brave, to be remembered, but also to understand that glory carried a price. The crossing of the hell, soldiers huddled together, some excited, some nervous, some silently gripping their weapons as if wood and iron could steady their hearts. Alexander, watching the European shore slowly shrink behind them, must have felt a tightness in his chest. Not regret, but the deep awareness that there would be no true going back. A road can be walked in both directions. When they reached the Asian side, and the army began to assemble again on new ground, lines forming, banners stirring in the wind, a hush passed through many ranks. They had done it. They had left their home continent. Ahead lay Persian forces, satraps who would soon gather to meet this bold advance. Alexander knew that his first clash with them would shape everything that followed. If he succeeded, the door to the empire would swing open a little wider. As dusk settled over this new shore, and the campfires of his army glowed warmly against the edge of the dark, Alexander may have walked alone for a while among the tents, listening to the murmur of his men, breathing the air of a land he had never seen before that day. Somewhere beyond the quiet circle of light, Persians, and far in the near distance, a river called Granicus flowed steadily toward its own meeting place with history. In the next part, we will stand with Alexander on the banks of that river beneath the open sky, as he meets the Persian satraps in his first great battle on Asian soil, testing not only his strategy and courage, but the strength of the bond between him and the men. You are now listening to Part 9. In this part, we will stand with Alexander at the Granicus River, where he fights his first great battle in Asia against the Persian satraps, and we will see how his wish to prove himself, his quiet fears, his enemies, and his faithful companions all meet in one calm but dangerous moment. News reached Alexander that Persian satraps were waiting for him near a river called Granicus. He had crossed the Hellespont with courage, but he knew that courage alone. His wish now was clear and simple. He wanted to show his men and his enemies that Macedon had come to fight and win, not to look and turn back. If he failed in this first battle on Persian soil, everything he hoped for could end at the water's edge. As the army moved through the low hills of Asia Minor, he thought often about the river ahead. Reports said that the Persians held the far bank. They had strong cavalry. To reach them, his own troops would have to cross the stream, climb the bank, and fight their way up, while missiles fell down on them. Inside himself, Alexander felt two voices. One voice told him to be careful, to wait for a better crossing, to remember that a king must think about tomorrow as well as today. The other voice, in the quiet of his tent, he weighed these thoughts like stones in his hands, trying to feel which one was heavier. Around him stood men who gave him strength. Parmenion, older and cautious, urged him to camp and attack at dawn or at another place. The companion cavalry, who had grown up with him, trusted him completely and would go wherever he led. The Macedonian their loyalty and skill formed his inner support. When they finally came within sight of the Granicus, they saw that it was not a wide river, but it ran fast enough to be dangerous. On the far bank, Persian cavalry stood in lines, their armour catching the light. Behind them waited the Greek mercenaries. The water, the slope, and the enemy together made a strong wall against him. Alexander rode along his side. They believed he would not dare to cross at once. Parmenion repeated his advice to wait. Alexander listened, then looked again at his own army. The men had followed him out of Macedon and across the sea. If he held back now, their first memory of Asia might be one of delay and caution. At last he chose. The battle would be fought here and now. The decision settled inside him, and he sent the order to prepare for attack. The army stirred with cavalry formed in lines. Alexander put on his helmet, so all could see that he would ride in front. Then, with Persepolis beneath him, he led the first squadrons down the bank and into the river. The water was cold and rough around the horses' legs. Stones shifted under hooves. Arrows and javelins began to fall from the far bank. For a few heartbeats, every step forward felt heavy and slow. He leaned into the climb and kept moving, his spear ready, his shield lifted. His companions, watching him, did the same. Their line bent around rocks and hidden holes, but it did not break. On the far bank, Persian cavalry charged down to meet them, hoping to strike the Macedonians while they were still in the water. The two forces met with a crash. Horses reared, metal rang, the river churned with spray and foam. He watched for openings, for the shapes of enemy leaders, for the places where a hard push might break the line. He aimed again and again at the points where command and courage met, knowing that if those points failed, the whole front might give way. Around him, his friends fought to protect him. More than once, a blow meant for Alexander struck another man instead. His helmet was marked, his armor, yet he did not let that fear change his decision. Behind the cavalry, the Macedonian phalanx entered the river next. They moved more slowly, but once enough of them reached the far side, they closed ranks and lowered their long spears. Their wall of points pushed forward step by step, with cavalry pressing from one side and the phalanx from another. The Persians began to lose the firm shape of their defence. Parts of their line, the confidence they had felt when they first looked down on the river, began to slip away. Soon, what had been a strong front turned into a retreat. Some Persians tried to pull back in order. Others simply turned and fled. The Greek mercenaries, tougher and more stubborn, held on longer but were surrounded and broken. Bit by bit, the noise of battle faded. The river. On the far bank, among his men, stood Alexander, wet with river water and sweat, tired in body but steady in mind. His first great test against Persia on Asian soil had ended in victory. The wish in his heart to show that he belonged on this side of the sea had not been answered by words, but by the hard work of his army and his own choice to lead from the front. The men looked at him with eyes that now held something deeper than simple respect for a king. They had seen him face the same arrows and blades they had faced. That night, as fires burned along the bank and the sky grew dark over the quiet water, Alexander could listen to the sound of the river and know that an important line had been crossed. He had met Persia in open. Ahead lay more rivers, more cities, and a great king named Darius, who could no longer ignore the young Macedonian who had stepped across the sea. In the next part, we will follow Alexander as he moves deeper into Asia, taking towns and roads that draw him toward Darius. While the shadow, you are now listening to part 10. In this part, we will walk slowly with Alexander in the days and hours before the Battle of Issus, when he knows at last that the great king Darius himself is near, and we will gently listen to his hopes, his fears, the threats surrounding him, the loyal friends at his side, and the quiet night that settles over both armies before dawn decides whose dream will continue. After the victory at the Granicus, Alexander moved deeper into Asia like a careful but determined traveller. Cities opened their gates, some willingly, some after brief resistance. Satraps fled or bowed, roads and coastal towns fell under his control, and step by step he traced a path that drew a long, thin line through the Persian Empire. Yet he knew always that these were only the outer folds of a much larger cloak. Somewhere beyond the horizon marched Darius III, the great king himself. In his heart, Alexander carried a wish that had grown from a boy's dream into a man's purpose. He wanted to stand face to face with the true centre of Persian power, not just its edges. If he could defeat Darius in open battle, the world would change shape. Old boundaries would blur, old certainties would fall. But along with that wish came a tightness in his chest that never fully left him. While his men laughed around campfires, telling stories of conquered towns and rich plunder, Alexander sometimes sat quietly with a map spread before him, tracing paths with one finger and wondering exactly where Darius would choose to meet him. Reports and rumours moved like wind. Some said the great king gathered his forces far inland, others that he was nearer than anyone guessed. The longer he stayed in one region, the more chance his supply lines could be cut. The more likely it became that unrest would grow behind him. He wanted to move forward, but not blindly. In the privacy of his thoughts, he asked himself if he was chasing Darius, or if Darius... When news finally came that Darius had taken a position behind him, near a narrow plain by the sea and the mountains, Alexander felt the strange, almost unreal jolt of a long-awaited moment arriving in an unexpected way. He had marched east, expecting to face the great king somewhere ahead. Instead, like two travellers circling a hill from opposite sides, they had almost... Alexander's inner balance shifted. His deep wish to meet this man, to test himself on that highest ground, was about to be answered. But along with that wish rose the quiet, honest fear that any thinking commander feels before such a trial. What if I fail? What if all these miles and all these dead, lead only to my ruin and the scattering of my men? He did not let that question show on his face, but in the stillness of his tent, when the evening wind brushed the canvas and the sounds of the camp softened into murmurs, it moved through his mind like a shadow. Beyond him, Darius had numbers, chariots, archers, and the pride of a long, rich tradition behind him. The Persians believed that the great king was favoured by the heavens simply by being who he was. They could not imagine that a younger ruler from a smaller kingdom would truly threaten the heart of their empire, Issus, with its mixture of the weather, the sickness that sometimes touched weary men, the strain of long marches. All these were quiet enemies that marched alongside Alexander's army. If they faltered here, it might not even require a brilliant plan from Darius to break them. But Alexander did not face these dangers alone. Around him stood the same companions who had ridden into the Granicus and beyond. Parmenion, Hephaestion, closer to him in age and spirit, moved like a shadow at his side, sharing both jokes and worries in the quiet hours, helping to carry the invisible weight that settled on Alexander's shoulders as the army grew larger and the stakes grew higher. The phalanx, those long rows of spears, remained his steady wall. The companion cavalry, loyal and proud, were still the sharp, mobile fire, advisors, scouts, interpreters, engineers, all formed a web of support around the central core of his leadership. Together, they studied the paths through the narrow passes, the rivers that marked the land, the best ways to move men so that they could arrive at Issus, ready, not exhausted. As they turned north to meet Darius, they passed through cramped defiles and along the Sal's edge. On some days, the march was slow and grinding, the men's legs heavy, but their spirits held up by the knowledge that something decisive lay ahead. On other days, a cool wind and clear sky made every step feel lighter, as if the land itself were guiding them to their appointment. Eventually, they reached the region near Issus. There, signs of the Persian presence appeared, trampled ground where many feet had passed. Alexander called councils, listened to reports, and slowly drew a picture in his mind of where Darius stood, how his lines might be arranged, how the narrowness of the place could help a smaller, more disciplined force if handled correctly. He understood that in this space numbers could be squeezed. The day before the battle, as the two great bodies of men settled into positions separated by distance but joined by expectation, a strange calm fell over the land. Tents were raised, fires lit, meals cooked. Armour was checked and sharpened. Some soldiers wrote letters home, their words more honest now that they felt the nearness of real danger. Others prayed, each man in his own way. Alexander moved through his camp slowly, speaking to some. He offered a firm hand on the shoulder. To others, a few quiet words about the enemies already defeated and the strength they had shown together. He did not promise safety, for he knew he could not. Instead, he promised that he would be with them where the fight was hardest, that he would not ask of them anything he would not risk himself. Those words settled into tired hearts like a soft, steadying weight. The air carried a chill that hinted of the mountains. Alexander retreated at last to his tent, but sleep did not come quickly. He thought of his father Philip and the unfinished plan that had begun all this. He thought of his mother, far away, who had long believed he was destined for more than Macedon's narrow valleys. He thought of Aristotle, of patient lessons under the trees. He thought of Achilles, and the fragile line between glorious victory and tragic fall. Slowly, out of all these thoughts, a single feeling emerged. Not pride, not fear alone, but a deep, calm acceptance that whatever happened at Issus would mark him forever. Either he would rise to meet Darius and break the myth of Persian invincibility, or he would fall in the attempt. There would be no small outcome here. At last, he lay down. Around him, thousands of other men did the same, each with his own private fear and hope. On the other side, in the Persian camp, Darius too must have walked among his tents, feeling the weight of his own crown, wondering about the young king from the west who refused to turn back. Between them stretched only a few miles of dark ground, empty and still for the moment. In the morning, that ground would be filled with movement and sound. As the final hours of night slipped, torches burned low. Horses shifted in their sleep. The sea sighed softly nearby. Above it all, the sky slowly began to pale. In the next part, we will stand on that pale edge of dawn with Alexander and his men as they form their lines under the first light, watching the mass of the Persian army across the field, and we will walk with them into the quiet storm of the Battle of Issus. You are now listening to part 11. In this part, we will stand very close to the long day of battle at Issus itself, when the quiet line between two kings finally breaks, and we will feel how Alexander's wish to defeat Darius, his hidden fears, the great Persian army, his faithful companions, and the slow turning of fate, all flow together like two rivers meeting. Dawn came to Issus not with a roar, but with a In the Macedonian camp, men woke to the cold air and the sounds of armour being lifted, straps tightened, horses snorting gently in the grey. Alexander rose early, as he always did before a battle. His wish was sharp and simple. He wanted this day to close a door, to break the illusion that the great king of Persia was untouchable. He wanted his men to feel, by evening, that they had stood against the centre of the empire and had yet, as he washed his face and put on his armour, another feeling moved quietly beneath that wish. He knew that if this day went badly, there might be no second chance. The lives of thousands rested on choices that could not be taken back. Even a brave heart, when it understands such weight, feels a small tremor. Alexander allowed himself to feel it for a moment, and then let it pass, like breath leaving his chest. Outside, officers called their units into position. The narrow plain between the mountains and the sea stretched out, its uneven ground ready to test tired feet. Across that space, the Persian army formed in deep lines, their banners fluttering, their numbers greater than anything many Macedonians had ever seen. At the centre, surrounded by guards and splendour, stood the chariot of Darius. To his men, Darius was more than a man. He was the living symbol. The sight of his ranks stretching far along the field must have made many Macedonian soldiers swallow hard, even if they did not say a word. Alexander felt that same pressure. A part of him, quiet but honest, wondered if he had led his companions too far into a world too large. He thought of his father's unfinished plan, and of how easy it would be in this narrow valley. But alongside that doubt stood memories of Pella, of lessons under trees with Aristotle, of the wild horse he had calmed, of Granicus where he had crossed cold water under a storm of arrows and come out alive. Those memories reminded him that he had faced fear before and had never allowed it to sit in the saddle. Fear could ride beside him, but not lead. On the Persian side, the great king, the valley's narrowness meant the Macedonians could not spread their line too wide. If any part of Alexander's formation broke, Persian mass could pour through, like water through a crack. There were also Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius, men trained in the same kind of warfare as Alexander's infantry. The land itself, sloping unevenly, could turn a careless step. All these outer threats gathered around Alexander like clouds. That morning, he did not stand alone against them. Parmenion held the left side of the Macedonian line, steady and careful, guarding the flank near the sea. He had warned Alexander again and again to watch for tricks, to remember that the enemy was not only strong, but clever. On the right, where the terrain was harder and the mountains loomed nearer, Alexander, near him rode Hephaestion, and other close friends, their faces calm but focused. The phalanx formed the solid heart of his army, pikes angled forward, shields held close. These men had marched with him over long distances. Their legs were tired, but their will was firm. As he rode along their front, Alexander spoke to them in a steady voice. He reminded them of their victories, of the long road they had walked to reach this point, of the He did not promise an easy battle. Instead, he promised that if they stood together, if they trusted their training and each other, this narrow field could become the place where a great empire began to bend. His words were not shouted. They were clear and measured, like stones laid one by one into a wall. When the time came, he turned his horse toward the right side, took a slow breath, and gave the signal to advance. The Persians responded, their own lines stirring, chariots and cavalry adjusting, archers readying arrows. The river, shallow but troublesome, cut across part of the field, and for a moment the Macedonian advance felt awkward, as if the whole army were trying to walk while someone pushed against its knees. Arrows fell, men stumbled. He aimed his main strength at the point where the Persian line bent, a place where the roughness of the terrain made communication harder for Darius's commanders. On the left, Parmenion had the difficult task of holding against superior numbers, keeping the Persians from wrapping around the Macedonian flank. His men fought hard, shields locking, spears thrusting. There the danger was constant, and for a time it seemed they might be overwhelmed. Alexander knew this. He also knew that if he tried to help everywhere at once, he would help nowhere enough, so he kept his focus on the right, where he saw his chance. With Persepolis beneath him and his companions at his side, he led a charge toward the weak curve in the Persian line. The ground was broken. but they moved with the practiced rhythm of horse. Alexander aimed not at random enemies, but at the places where he sensed leadership, where standards rose and officers shouted. If those points fell, the bodies around them would begin to lose shape. Slowly, stubbornly, the Persian front in that place began to crack. Dust rose. The sounds of shouting and metal grew louder, then wavered. From his chariot, Darius saw that the fear, perhaps, touched him in that moment, or the experienced commanders around him saw the danger and urged retreat. In any case, the great king's chariot turned and began to pull away. The sight of their ruler leaving the field, even if only to escape what seemed certain death or capture, rippled through the Persian ranks like a cold wind. Order loosened. A strong front became a scattered mass. When he learned that Parmenian's side was still under heavy pressure, he turned some of his strength back to help relieve them, making sure that victory was complete, not just in one corner of the field. By the time the sun had climbed higher, the Battle of Issus was decided. The Persians were in retreat, many dead or captured, their lines broken. Darius had escaped, leaving behind his chariot, his cloak, his bow, and even his family. The great king had not died, and Alexander knew that meant the story was not finished. But something deep had shifted. The world had watched the two names, one ancient, one new, meet and had seen which one bent. As evening approached, Alexander walked through the quieter field. The river still flowed, the mountain still stood. The sky above Issus looked just as it had the day before. Alexander ordered that Darius's family be treated with respect, not as trophies, but as people caught in the net of war. This choice, gentle inside the hardness of victory, showed that he wanted not only to conquer, but to be seen as a certain kind of king. That night, as the camp settled and the wounded were tended, Alexander may have sat alone for a short time, listening. He had reached and grasped a great dream at Issus, but he felt, too, the outline of new tasks forming ahead. Darius still lived, and the empire still stretched far. There were cities that would resist, islands and strongholds that would not open their gates. Somewhere out on the water lay a city on an island called Tyre, proud and stubborn. In the next part, we will follow Alexander as he turns from this narrow battlefield toward the long, patient work of facing that city in the sea, where waves, walls, and time itself will test his will in a quieter but no less demanding way. You are now listening to part 12. In this part, we will follow Alexander to the walls of Tyre, a proud island city in the sea, and we will feel how his wish to control the coast, his inner impatience, the stubborn resistance of the Tyrians, the help of his engineers and sailors, the long, slow building of a causeway, and the quiet, heavy ending of the siege all unfold like waves against stone. After Issus, the path into the heart of the Persian Empire seemed more open, yet Alexander knew that land alone was not enough. If he wanted to move safely deeper into Asia, he needed control of the sea roads too. Persian fleets still sailed, and as long as coastal cities remained uncertain or hostile, those ships could strike behind him. In his heart, a clear wish formed, to secure the eastern Mediterranean coast, to quiet each harbour so that his army would not march with the constant fear of an enemy navy behind its shoulder. Most cities, seeing the fall of Issus and the retreat of Darius, chose to open their gates or negotiate, but one city stood apart, like a single rock that refused the tide. Tyre, it sat not on the mainland, but on an island, its high walls rising from the sea. The Tyrians were proud masters of ships, traders whose sails had touched many distant shores. They looked at Alexander with cool eyes. They were willing to flatter him, to speak fair words, but they did not wish to let his full control enter their sacred heart. Alexander, when he first approached Tyre, did not come as a raging conqueror. He sent envoys, asked for cooperation. His wish beneath the surface was not just practical. Tyre had an old, respected name, and he wanted that name to stand beside his own as something safely folded into his growing order. But the Tyrians saw danger in too much closeness. They refused to admit him in the way he wanted. Their answer, polite on the outside, carried a steel edge. They would not become another city bending under his direct hand. That refusal lit a quiet fire in Alexander. Another part felt a sting to his pride. He had crossed seas, defeated satraps, and driven Darius from Issus. To be blocked now by one island city felt wrong, like being halted by a single closed door at the end of a long corridor. Inside, impatience stirred. He could have turned away, left Tyre to stand alone while he moved in east. But he understood deeply that leaving such a city free behind him would be like leaving a watchful enemy at his back. That choice created a new kind of struggle, not only against the Tyrians but against his own nature. Alexander was used to swift action, to battles decided in a day, to the sharp, clean lines of cavalry charges and phalanx advances. Tyre would not offer him that. It was surrounded by water, with strong walls facing the waves. His army had no easy way to rush it. To conquer Tyre, he would need... The Tyrians, for their part, trusted their walls and their ships. They knew that ordinary sieges could starve a city on land, but water gave them paths to bring in food, to attack from unexpected angles, to harass any slow-building project from the sea. They were the outer force resisting his will, using height, distance, and the sea itself as their ally. Alexander looked out over the narrow strip of water separating the island from the mainland and saw around him were men who could help. His engineers, clever and experienced from earlier campaigns, suggested a bold idea: build a causeway from the shore to the island, stone by stone, earth by earth, until his siege engines could be rolled up to the walls. It was an enormous task, the kind that would test not only wood and rock, but the spirit of every worker. His sailors, drawn from cities that had now joined him, could also, step by step, a strategy formed, turn the sea itself into a road. Work began. Day after day, men carried stones and dumped them into the shallow water, watching the line of the causeway slowly, painfully, push forward from the shore. At first, progress felt encouraging. The water was not deep near the mainland, and the growing path was like a visible sign of Alexander's will stretching outward. But as they moved farther, from their ships and from the high safety of their walls, they launched attacks. Fire ships drifted toward the unfinished causeway, trying to burn the wooden structures and siege engines. Arrows and stones rained down. In some moments, months of labour seemed ready to fall back into the sea. Each setback was a test of Alexander's inner patience. It would have been easy for a proud, quick-tempered man to throw up his hands, to call the whole project foolish, but each time the sea and the Tyrians struck, he answered not with despair but with adjustment. He strengthened the sides of the causeway, brought in more ships, gathered fleets from other Phoenician cities that had joined him. Slowly, the sea around Tyre filled not just with enemy sails, but with those of his own allies. Storms came and went. Men were lost to waves. At night, the camp on the shore glowed with weary fires, and the soldiers spoke in low tones of the stubborn city ahead. Some wondered if the gods themselves favoured Tyre, letting its walls shine untouched above the water, while their own backs ached from endless work. Alexander walked among them, not roaring, not promising easy victory, but reminding them that they were building more than a road. They were showing the world that his presence, calm and persistent, kept their hands moving. Little by little, the causeway reached the foot of the walls. Siege towers rolled forward on this man-made strip of land. Ships fitted with rams and towers pressed from the sea. The Tyrians, fierce to the end, fought back with fire, with grappling hooks, with courage born of desperation. Yet even their strength held like a fist. When the final assaults came, they were sudden and fierce, after so many months of slow preparation. Alexander's men broke through parts of the wall, poured into the city's narrow streets, and the long tension snapped. The fall of Tyre was harsh. Many died, and others were taken as captives. The proud island that had trusted its distance from the mainland found that the world was smaller than it had believed. Alexander, he had proven that even the sea could not keep him out, that his will could turn water into ground. But he had also paid a high price in time, effort, and blood. The lesson of Tyre was carved not only into its broken stones, but into his mind. Some victories are not bright, sudden flames but slow, grinding storms that leave everyone changed. As he looked out from the conquered island toward the wider sea, perhaps his eyes turned south, toward the sea. There, another chapter of his journey would open, one of welcome instead of resistance, of founding a new city and seeking answers from an ancient oracle in the desert. In the next part, we will travel with him along those calmer shores, into Egypt, where the Nile, the silent statues, and the whispering desert at Siwa will meet. You are now listening to part 13. In this part, we will walk quietly with Alexander into Egypt, where the people welcome him as a liberator, where he traces the first lines of a new city called Alexandria beside the sea, and where he travels far into the desert to the oracle of Siwa, seeking not victory, but answers about who he is and what his path truly means. After the long, grinding storm at Tyre, cities that might once have resisted looked at the broken island and thought more carefully. Many opened their gates, some out of fear, others out of calculation, hoping to stand on the side of the one who seemed to be bending the world. In Alexander's heart, the wish to secure every harbour still burned, but under it now lay a quieter desire. He wanted a place that would be more than a conquest, a place, the land that waited ahead, broad and ancient, offered such a possibility. Egypt. When he entered Egypt, it was not like his entry into cities taken by storm. The people there had lived under Persian rule and had grown weary of distant kings who did not understand the Nile or their old gods. They did not greet Alexander with arrows and closed gates. Instead, many saw in him, they welcomed him as a liberator, and their priests and leaders stepped forward in procession, bringing offerings and blessings. For a young king who had spent years forcing his way through resistance, this soft opening of doors carried its own strange weight. His wish to be more than a destroyer stirred. He wanted to be remembered not only for the cities he had broken, but for the places he had built. As he moved along the Nile, the river did not rush. It simply went on, feeding fields, sustaining lives, ignoring the noise of passing armies. The great statues and temples, older than any Greek city he had known, rose from the earth like frozen memories. Here, time spoke, with a deeper, slower voice than the one he had heard in Macedonia or Asia Minor. He must have felt both small and strangely honoured. Near the Mediterranean coast, looking out over the open blue water and the curve of land, Alexander felt his thoughts turn toward the future. At a place where the Nile's influence stretched but did not dominate, he stood on a shore that could one day become a meeting place for ships from many lands. There he traced, according to story, the outline of a new city, Alexandria, using flour instead of chalk. Birds swooped down to eat the flour, and some around him worried at the omen, but others saw it as a sign that the city would be rich and well supplied. For Alexander, this was not just symbolism. He imagined a place where Greek language and Egyptian wisdom and distant trade routes could cross, a harbour where the world's knowledge might gather. The thought filled him with a different kind of ambition, less about conquest and more about shaping something. Yet even in this moment of creation, he carried an inner unease. The more ground he covered, the more people he ruled, the more he felt the question that had followed him since Pella grow sharper. Who am I, truly, beneath the armour and titles? Merely Philip's son, carried forward by chance and courage? Or was there something more, some thread of destiny that placed him here and not another? The stories his mother had told, the victories that seemed to stack up beyond ordinary expectation, all these whispered to him that his life might be guided by more than human hands. But his lessons with Aristotle, his own clear mind, and the very real weight of the dead on his conscience reminded him that he was still flesh and blood, bound to the same earth as any soldier who fell on the field. In Egypt, he heard of an ancient oracle far away in the western desert, at a place called Siwa, where the god Ammon, whom Greeks linked with Zeus, was worshipped. Men said that this oracle could speak of origin and fate, that it had answered kings before him. The thought took hold of Alexander like a soft but persistent hand. He took a chosen group and set out across the sands, leaving behind the green ribbon of the Nile. The desert spread on all sides, wide and silent, a sea of another kind. Days passed under a white sky, nights under a dome of stars, so clear that they felt almost within reach. The air was dry and honest. It hid nothing. As the sun beat down and the heat wrapped around him, Alexander's thoughts had room to move freely, without the noise of cities or the constant demands of command. He may have wondered, as he rode, whether he was wise to seek such answers, whether any human truly wanted to hear what the gods might say about his end. According to tales told later, there were moments when guides lost their way, when the desert seemed endless and the path uncertain, but each time they found direction again, as if some invisible line drew them toward the oasis. When at last they reached Siwa, green trees and water appeared like a quiet miracle in the middle of the sand. The temple rose from this small cradle of life, simple yet powerful in its isolation. As Alexander entered, priests of Ammon approached him with rituals older than his own people's myths. What exactly was said inside the oracle's shadowed heart remains a mystery. Some claimed the god greeted him as a son, as if he were more than just Philip's child, linking him to Zeus Ammon himself. Others believed the priests spoke. Perhaps the truth lay somewhere between, that the oracle gave him phrases wide enough for many meanings, and he chose the one that made sense of his journey so far. Whatever he heard, he came out changed, not in his body, not in his visible habits, but in the quiet way he carried himself. The visit did not turn him into a god. He still bled, still grew tired, still had to think. He began to speak more often, not just of conquering for Macedon, but of bringing order to many peoples, of a mission that seemed to stretch beyond his own small country, and even beyond his own lifetime. That belief, whether granted by gods or born from his own imagination, gave him strength in dark moments. It also, when he left Siwa and returned to the fuller riverside life of Egypt, he carried both the blessing of the oracle and the memory of the desert silence with him. He had been welcomed as a liberator, had laid the first lines of a city that would carry his name, and had sought confirmation that his path was more than random. But Egypt was not a final resting place. Beyond its western sands and northern waves lay the rest of the Persian Empire, with Darius still alive, gathering strength on a vast plain where another. As Alexander looked east again, perhaps from some quiet point along the Nile at dusk, he might have seen in his mind not statues and calm water, but a wide open field under foreign stars, a place called Gaugamela, where the last solid shape of Persian power would stand before him. In the next part, we will leave the gentle Nile and the whispering desert behind, and we will walk with him back across the lands he has taken as he moves toward that plain, where one more long day between him and Darius will decide whether his dream remains a vision. You are now listening to part 14. In this part, we will stay beside Alexander as he leaves the calm of Egypt, marches back through the lands he has taken, and finally reaches the wide plain of Gaugamela, where under cold stars he prepares for the greatest battle of his life against Darius, and we will feel his deep wish to finish what he began, his quiet fears, the huge Persian army, the friends and soldiers who support him, the tense night before the fight. Leaving behind the slow river of Egypt and the fresh lines of Alexandria in the sand, his wish had grown clearer than ever before. He no longer wanted only to hurt Persia on its edges or push it back from the coast. He wanted to end the old story of Persian rule and write a new one in its place. To do that, he knew he must meet Darius again, not by accident, not in a narrow valley, but in a great open space where as he marched through Syria and Mesopotamia, he felt the world become wider and flatter. Rivers grew larger, cities more scattered, the sky more open. Messengers brought word that Darius was gathering a mighty army on a plain near a place called Gaugamela. The great king had chosen his ground carefully, smoothing the field. He would come with cavalry from many lands, with infantry, archers, and all the splendor of an empire showing its full strength. Alexander listened to these reports and felt a familiar movement inside him, a mixture of bright courage and low, steady worry. He wished deeply to face Darius and settle everything between them in one great test, but he understood the cost. If he lost here, far from Macedon and Greece, there would be no friendly city. His men would be hunted across foreign fields, and his dream would fall like a tent in a sudden wind. These thoughts did not leave him, even as he rode at the head of his columns with his armor shining in the sun. Around him, dust rose from thousands of feet. The phalanx marched in their deep, familiar blocks. The companion cavalry moved like a living blade along the side. Allies from... There were moments on the road when the weight of guiding so many lives pressed heavily on his chest. At night, when the camp spread out like a small city of flickering lights, he sometimes walked between the tents, listening to laughter, to songs, to quiet conversations about home. He knew that many of these men would not see their homes again, no matter what he did. That knowledge did not stop him, but it kept his... He had not forgotten Issus. He had not forgotten the shame of leaving his chariot and his family behind. Now he gathered a larger army, called in allies from east and west, and chose a field where his numbers and chariots could spread out wide. The ground at Gaugamela was carefully cleared of stones and bumps, so that his scythed chariots could rush fast and cut through enemy ranks. In this way, the outer world set the stage for their meeting, a wide open plain under a broad sky, one side heavy with sheer numbers and bright banners, the other smaller but tightly bound by training and shared trials. As Alexander drew near, he sent scouts forward to study the ground. He rode out himself to look across the plain, judging its shape, its small rises and dips. Inside, a thin line of fear still whispered that this might be too much even for him, that the gods could tire of his endless success. But another, stronger part of him believed that all his earlier struggles had been steps toward this exact place. He thought of his father Philip, whose dream had been to strike Persia, but who had never reached this. He thought of his men, hardened by years of marching and siege, who had followed him across water and desert. Those thoughts formed a kind of inner shield around his heart. The night before the battle, the Macedonian camp was quieter than usual. Fires burned low, and most men tried to sleep. Though some wrote or spoke of their families, others sharpened weapons, not because they were dull, but because their hands needed something to do. Alexander called his commanders together and laid out his plan. He would not simply stand and accept the full weight of the Persian front. Instead, he would shape his line in such a way that he could draw part of Darius's army away from its centre, opening a path toward the great king himself. He would use His officers listened and nodded, each man carrying part of the burden into his own heart. When they left him, Alexander did something simple and human. He slept. Some later said he slept deeply, so deeply that his officers had to wake him at dawn. Whether that is exact truth or not, it carries a meaning. He had done all he could in thought, and now he trusted his plan, his men, and whatever gods might be watching. At the same time, many soldiers were confident in their numbers, but Darius himself had to fight not only an external enemy but memories of his earlier defeat. He stood as the centre of a great circle, but that circle could become a trap if panic spread. Over both camps, the same stars shone cold and distant, not taking sides. When morning came, the plain of Gaugamela slowly filled with ordered lines. The Persians stretched far. Darius stood in a high chariot at the centre, surrounded by guards. The Macedonian army looked small in comparison, but its lines were deep, its units well drilled. Alexander placed Parmenion on the left again, with orders to hold as best he could against whatever swept toward him. On the right, Alexander gathered his companions, ready to move He arranged some units at angles, prepared to face attacks from more than one direction, for he knew the Persians would try to surround him. As the two sides began to move, dust rose in great clouds. Persian chariots rushed forward, blades on their wheels meant to cut through ranks and send terror ahead of them. But Alexander had planned for this. His men opened. What could have been a wave of panic became instead a burst of noise that soon died away. Still, the danger was far from over. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion struggled as Persian cavalry pressed hard, trying to turn that side. On the right, Alexander saw the opportunity he had hoped for. By shifting his wings slightly outward, he drew the Persian cavalry toward him, stretching their line and leaving. Then at the right moment he turned sharp and drove inward with his companions straight toward the heart of the enemy. The clash was fierce and close. Alexander aimed again for the places where leadership sat. As his wedge cut deeper, he came within sight of Darius's chariot. The great king, seeing the Macedonian king fighting his way toward him, faced the same terrible choice he had known at Issus: stand and risk capture or death, which might throw his entire army into hopeless confusion, or pull back and hope his commanders could hold without him. Once again, he chose to flee. His chariot turned, then gave way to a horse for faster escape. They did not all flee at once, but the strength went out of their centre. Some units broke, others hesitated, leaving gaps that Alexander's men pushed into. The great smooth surface of the Persian host began to crack. On the left, Parmenions still fought desperately, and for a time Alexander had to pull part of his strength away from chasing Darius to help his hard-pressed wing. Even in victory, he thought not only of glory, but of keeping his army home. When the long day finally ended and the sun sank lower, the field of Gaugamela belonged to him. The Persian army was shattered. Darius was in flight, rushing east with a small guard and a broken crown. The empire he represented had been struck so deeply that it would never truly recover. Alexander, standing on that wide, dusty plain, knew that something larger than a single battle had happened. An old order, yet he did not shout in triumph. He walked among the living and the dead, among friends and strangers, feeling the heavy cost that lay beneath the victory. Persia was not yet fully his, and Darius still breathed somewhere ahead. There would be more marches, more choices, more shadows. As night returned and the stars came out again over Gaugamela, in the next part, we will follow Alexander as he passes through the open gates of Persian capitals, walks the halls of kings in Babylon and Persepolis, faces the temptation of wealth and revenge, and makes the fateful choice that will burn itself into both stone. You are now listening to part 15. In this part, we will walk quietly beside Alexander as he passes through the open gates of the Persian heartland, steps into the palaces of Babylon and Persepolis, faces the glittering weight of treasure and revenge, struggles with his own anger and dreams, listens to the voices of his friends, and finally makes the calm but terrible choice to burn Persepolis, leaving a flame that will follow him into the road ahead. No longer led toward a distant enemy line. It led into an empire that had lost its center. Darius was still alive, fleeing east, but much of Persia now lay open before Alexander like a great house whose doors had been left unlocked in haste. His wish, which had won, he wanted not only victory, he wanted to step into that house and take hold of it, to walk its halls as its master, to see if he could shape what had once belonged to others into something new that carried his name. Yet, as he rode forward, he also felt a quiet unease. To conquer a land from the outside is one thing, to live inside it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the boy from Pella still wondered how a Macedonian could truly become king of Persia without losing himself in the process. Babylon came first, wide and rich, with its thick walls and hanging gardens and busy streets. The city did not resist him. Instead, it welcomed him with processions. Carpets rolled across the He entered to the sound of music, not screaming, and as he passed through its gates, the air smelled not of smoke and blood, but of incense and cooking fires. It was a different kind of conquest, one that felt almost like being invited into a dream. In the great halls, Alexander saw treasures gathered from many parts of the world, shining metals, bright fabrics, strange carvings, and animals he had never seen before. The sheer scale. For a moment, in that flood of wealth and comfort, a new inner danger whispered to him, that a man carrying such power might forget the simple, sharp edge that had brought him here, might sink into softness, into the slow pleasures of palaces, and let his great journey end in a long, lazy drift. He felt that temptation like warm water around his ankles, and knew he must step carefully. More treasure, more palaces, more signs of how much the Persian kings had gathered over generations. The outer obstacles he faced now were no longer walls and spears, but the weight of luxury, the expectations of Persian nobles, and the practical challenge of ruling people very different from his Macedonian core. Some Persians watched him with curiosity, others with quiet resentment, a few with hope that he might bring a better order. His allies, Parmenion, Hephaestion, the generals and administrators who had marched with him, helped him begin to sort this tangled new world. They advised him to reward the loyal, to keep local officials where possible, to respect customs so that the new order would not feel like a foreign chain. In many areas, he listened. He kept certain Persian systems, allowed different peoples to keep their rights. Inside, yet one place waited ahead that would pull him into a different mood altogether. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian kings, a city of grand palaces and carved stone, heavy with symbols of the empire he had just broken. As he approached Persepolis, he did not come only as a conqueror, he came also as a Greek, a child of a land that still remembered Persian invasions long ago, the burning of temples. Old stories of Xerxes and the wars between East and West lived in the memory of his companions. Those memories were like sparks in dry grass. When Persepolis opened its gates and Alexander walked its halls, he saw, carved into walls and columns, images of tribute, of subject peoples bringing riches to the great king. To some of his men, It felt like walking inside the very pride. He admired the beauty, the craft, the long effort that had built these palaces, but he also felt the weight of old crimes and slights pressing up from the past. It was as if the city itself were a question spoken aloud. Now that you stand here, what will you do with the memory of what Persia once did to your people? At first he did not answer. He took control of the treasure stored there, an enormous wealth that could pay his army. He allowed his men some time to rest, to feel the relief of safe roofs and full tables. Yet at night, in the lamplight, his thoughts turned again and again to the idea of revenge, of making a statement so clear that even the dead would understand it. There were voices around him too, stirring that fire. Certain companions, especially those who felt strongly Greek more than Macedonian, reminded him of Athens, of temple. One night, during a great feast when wine flowed and music filled the air, Alexander sat among his friends in a hall heavy with Persian decoration. The mood was loose. The walls almost seemed to sway with the laughter. A suggestion rose, maybe half in play, half in serious thought, that he should burn the palaces of Persepolis as an offering of vengeance to Greece, a symbolic act that would show the world that the old wounds had finally been answered. Alexander listened. The memory of Greek suffering, stories told in his childhood, mixed with the intoxicating feeling of standing at the very heart of the conquered empire. Inside him, two desires collided. One wanted to show restraint, to keep Persepolis as a living sign of his new rule. The other wanted a fire bright enough to be seen by memory itself, a flame that would say clearly, the East that once came to burn our temples has now had its own throne room touched by fire. In that moment, the second desire won. The order was given. Torches were taken up. Flames were set. Slowly at first, then hungrily, fire climbed pillars and spread along painted beams. Smoke rose into the night, thick and dark. The great halls of Persepolis, which had seen so many kings appear in ceremonial splendor, now flickered in orange and red, their carved images glowing and then blackening as the heat ran along the walls. Alexander watched, and for a while the sight must have filled something inside him that had long demanded balance between Greece and Persia. It was as if he had turned all old grievances into flame and let them. The fire did not know friend or foe. It devoured beauty and pride together. In the morning light, when the smoke thinned and the damage became clear, he saw not only a symbol of defeated arrogance, but also a wound in the physical memory of a great civilization. Some say he regretted the act, realizing that he had allowed a moment of heated emotion and drunken encouragement. Whether every detail of that regret is true or not, it is easy to imagine the thoughtful part of him standing among the char and ash, wondering if he had betrayed his own belief in understanding and order for the brief, harsh satisfaction of revenge. For his men, the burning of Persepolis was proof that their king did not forget Greek pain. For the act would follow Alexander in stories, a bright, troubling flame that historians would discuss long after the smoke itself had vanished. Yet even this fire did not end his path. Persepolis burned, but Darius still lived, running deeper into his own lands, trying to gather what remained of his authority. The true end of the Achaemenid king would not come in a palace. As Alexander turned his gaze from the blackened stones and looked east, he saw not only falling embers behind him, but long, rough tracks ahead, into Bactria, into high, cold lands and narrow passes, where a murdered king would lie in the dust, and a young Macedonian conqueror would meet a woman named Roxana. In the next part, we will leave the great palaces and move into those harsher, distant regions walking beside Alexander as he chases the fading shadow of Darius, meets betrayal on foreign soil, and begins to dream of a world where Greeks and Eastern peoples might... You are now listening to part 16. In this part, we will walk with Alexander into the far eastern lands of the old Persian Empire, into Bactria and Sogdiana, where he chases the fading shadow of Darius, meets betrayal in lonely places, finds a young woman named Roxana, and begins to dream of a world where Greeks and Eastern peoples might live not apart, but quietly mixed together. When the smoke of Persepolis had drifted away, and the treasures of Persia lay under his seal, Alexander knew his wish now was not just to take the great king's palaces. He wanted to meet the man himself, to make the end clear and complete. Part of him longed to offer Darius a chance to stand beside him as a lesser king. Part of him wanted to show that there could be only one centre of power, yet under that wish lived a faint, uncomfortable feeling. With every step he took deeper into Asia, he was becoming something new, and he did not yet know what that meant. As he marched eastward, the land rose and roughened. The soft plains around Babylon and Susa gave way to high passes, cold winds, and narrow valleys. Bactria and Sogdiana, far from the warm heart of the empire, were places where local lords were proud and hard, more attached to their own hills than to any distant throne. The road was long. One day, news came that struck Alexander with a quiet, heavy blow. Darius had been found, not by him, not in honourable battle, but by his own men, and killed as he fled. Bessus, a satrap from Bactria, and other nobles, fearing Alexander and losing faith in their king, had seized Darius and left him wounded to die by the side of a lonely road. When Alexander finally reached the place, he did not find a crowned ruler surrounded by guards. For a moment he stood, not as a conqueror, but as a man looking at the end of a long line of kings, reduced to silence in the dust. He covered Darius with his own cloak, and according to the stories, promised to take care of his family and give him a proper burial. His wish for a final clear meeting had been taken from him by others' treachery. Inside he felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that there was now no rival king. Yet, even in death, Darius's shadow shaped Alexander's path. Bessus claimed the Persian title for himself in the Far East, calling on local tribes to see him as the new king. To Alexander, this was more than rebellion. It was an insult to the memory of the man whose place he now meant to take. The outer enemy was no longer a distant crowned figure, but a shifting web of local lords, bandit leaders, and mountain fighters. Their lands were hard to reach, full of narrow tracks and sudden ambushes. The campaign that followed was not like Issus or Gaugamela. There was no single long line of battle, no one day that decided everything. Instead, there were many small fights, sudden strikes, long chases across cold rivers and high ridges. Alexander's army, used to set-piece battles and grand cities, now had to learn a different rhythm. Surprise attacks at dawn, climbing frozen slopes. Inside, Alexander struggled with a new kind of weariness. He had won the empire's heart. Now he had to tame its restless edges. It was like trying to hold water in his hands. Each time he gripped one valley, unrest slipped away into another. Still, he did not turn back. Supported by his faithful generals, he pushed on, following Bessus's trails until the rebel was finally caught by his own men and handed over. Alexander ordered that in this he sent a message. He meant to stand in Darius's place, not just as a conqueror, but as a protector of the idea of Persian kingship, now folded into his own. While soldiers hunted rebels in the hills and built garrisons to hold the land, another, softer story began to form around him. In one of these high regions, at a time when fighting paused for a while, Alexander attended a local feast given by a Bactrian noble who had chosen. There, among music, simple dances, and the flicker of lamps on carved walls, he saw a young woman, Roxana. She was not a princess of a great capital, not wrapped in heavy gold or sitting on a throne. She was the daughter of a local noble, with eyes that held both caution and quiet strength, and a face that seemed to carry the clear. For a man who had moved from battlefield to battlefield, surrounded by officers and soldiers, her presence was like a small, unexpected spring in a rocky place. Alexander, who had often treated marriage as a tool in a king's hand, felt something more personal stir. Yet even this feeling was wrapped in politics. He wished to bind these eastern lands to himself, not only by fear. To marry a woman from Bactria was to say to its people, "Your families and mine will now be linked. This is your empire too." Inside, he wrestled with what this meant. Some of his Macedonian companions, proud of their own ways, might see such a marriage as stepping too far into foreign customs. They already felt uneasy as he adopted parts of Persian dress, sat on Persian thrones, and expected forms of respect. His desire to blend peoples, to create a mixed world where Greek and Persian and others lived under one pattern, created a quiet tension in his own camp. But Alexander was no longer only the boy from Pella. The lands he had crossed had changed him. When he chose to marry Roxana, it was both a private and a public act. The ceremony, simple compared to the grand rituals of a royal capital, joined two in others watched with thoughtful eyes, sensing that their king was reaching for something beyond their old idea of conquest. For Alexander, the marriage brought a small island of warmth into the cold, practical sea of campaign life. Roxana, with her mountain grace and calm presence, became a gentle centre he could return to in his mind when at the same time he began more clearly to draw Eastern nobles into his circle, placing them in command, trusting them with tasks, showing that he did not plan to rule only through foreign hands. This new vision, a mixed court, a blended army, was like a fragile plant pushing up through rocky ground. It had roots in his early lessons about understanding different peoples, but it also carried risks. Some of his Macedonian officers grumbled, others feared being pushed aside by newly favoured Persians and Bactrians. Inside the king himself, an inner conflict grew, how to move forward into this wider, shared world without losing the loyalty of the hard, simple men who had brought him here. And still, the campaigning went on. Small rebellions flaring. By the time Bactria and Sogdiana were more or less settled, Alexander had spent years away from Macedon, walking on soil that would have seemed like the edge of a myth to the boy he once was. Now, instead of seeing Asia as a distant mass on a map, he felt its breath, tasted its winters, heard its many languages. His dream of a mixed world, of marriages between his officers and local women, of shared customs, of a kingdom that was not simply Greek or Persian, it was beginning, awkwardly and imperfectly, to take shape among real people. Yet the horizon in his mind did not stop at these eastern mountains. Beyond them lay tales of another land, rich and strange, where great rivers flowed and elephants fought in battle. India, as the Greeks called it, waited like a faint outline in mist, calling softly to the part of Alexander. As he stood one evening on a high ridge, feeling the cold wind on his face and looking toward that unseen east, his cloak tugged gently behind him, and somewhere inside a quiet room, Roxana's lamp burned with a steady flame. In the next part, we will follow him as he answers that far call, leading his weary but loyal army toward India, through new rains and forests, and into meetings with war elephants and kings. You are now listening to part 17. In this part, we will stay close to Alexander and his men as they cross into India, face the deep river of Hydaspes, fight King Porus with his tall elephants, and we will gently feel not only the danger of that battle, but the growing weariness and quiet reluctance in the hearts of soldiers who have followed their king farther than they ever dreamed. By the time Alexander led his army toward India, they were older now, marked by scars, sun, and long memories of deserts, sieges, and distant plains. Alexander's wish still burned bright. He wanted to see what lay beyond each new ridge, to meet kings no Greek had ever faced, to stand on banks of rivers that had only been lines on old maps. Deep inside, that same childlike question remained: how far does the world go? But now it wore the armour of a conqueror and spoke with the calm voice of a king. Some dreamed of home, of cool Macedonian evenings, of fields and families and quiet days without marching. Others wished at least for a pause, a long rest in some rich settled land. They loved their king, and many were proud to share his victories, but in their hearts a new feeling had begun to grow, the sense that they were marching not only across the world, but away from the life they might still have had. Outside, the land itself became a new kind of enemy. To reach India, they crossed high, cold mountains where thin air bit at their lungs. Then the world changed again. Heavy rains fell, softer earth clung to their boots, and strange plants and animals appeared along the paths. Rivers were broader, their currents dark and strong. The sky seemed to echo with distant thunder, even when no reports came of local rulers, some ready to talk, others to resist. Among them was Porus, a king whose realm lay along the Hydaspes river. He would not bow at the sight of a foreign army. He had tall war elephants, proud cavalry, and brave infantry. To his people he was a strong tree rooted deep in their soil. He would not bend without a struggle. When Alexander reached the Hydaspes, he saw at once that this river was not a small obstacle. Its waters ran deep. The far bank held Porus's forces, elephants standing like living towers among the men. Any simple crossing in full daylight would mean disaster, as the slow line of men and horses in the water would be easy targets. Alexander's mind, trained by many earlier campaigns, began to search for a different path. Inside, he felt both excitement and concern. He wanted to defeat Porus, not just for conquest, but to prove to his own heart that even at the edge of... At the same time, he heard the unspoken tiredness in his army, and he knew that each new risk he demanded cut away another thin slice of their remaining patience. As always, he did not stand alone. His generals and scouts studied the river with him, searching for narrower bends, for islands, for any place where a surprise crossing might work. Officers like Hephaestion and others he trusted rode. The soldiers, though weary, prepared their gear with familiar discipline. They had followed Alexander through so many dangers that their bodies moved almost by habit, even as their hearts whispered that this road had already been long enough. The Persians and Bactrians now in his service added their own skills, bringing knowledge of local conditions, offering ideas for how to manage elephants. In this mix of old and new companions, his vision of a blended force was already shaping the way he fought. Alexander decided on a careful trick. He left part of his army in the main camp, making small, noisy movements to keep Porus watching the obvious point, while he quietly took a strong group upstream during a dark and stormy night. Thunder rolled, rain fell. Hidden by the noise and weather, his men crossed at a less expected spot, using boats and makeshift rafts, some even swimming with horses through the swelling river. It was dangerous work. Bodies slipped, hooves struck unseen rocks, and for a time, the water itself seemed to fight them. But step by step, stroke by stroke, they clawed their way to the far side. When dawn broke cold and grey, Porus realised the Indian king moved to meet him, bringing elephants and infantry forward. The plain near the Hydaspes became a stage not only for two kings, but for two different ways of war. For the Macedonians, the sight of the elephants was deeply unsettling. These animals were larger than anything they had faced before, towering above horses and men, carrying archers and spears. Inside many soldiers, fear rose like a cold wave. How do you fight a living wall with tusks? Alexander understood this. He knew that if his men gave in to terror, the line would break. So he used calm and simple orders, telling his skirmishers to harass the elephants, to wound them from a distance, to target riders and handlers, while the phalanx tried to keep its shape. His cavalry, trusted companions at his side, worked to pull Porus. The battle was long and noisy, thick with mud, screams, and the heavy breathing of men and beasts. Elephants charged, crushing some underfoot, but they were also wounded, confused, and turned back on their own lines. The river flashed in the corner of many eyes, a dark border that prevented easy escape. Through it all, Alexander moved where the fight was hardest, showing himself so his men would know. His height and presence among his men gave them courage, and more than once the struggle leaned uncertainly between the two sides. Only slowly did the weight of Macedonian discipline and Alexander's flexible tactics tilt the balance. When at last Porus was wounded and could no longer keep his army together, the battle began to ebb. The elephants maddened and hurt. The plain that had seemed like a place of endless strength for Porus now lay scattered with fallen men, dying animals, and broken gear. Alexander, seeing that the heart of resistance was broken, called an end to the slaughter. When Porus was brought before him, standing wounded but still proud, Alexander did not mock or crush him. Instead, he asked the Indian king how he wished to be treated. Alexander, recognizing in him a reflection of his own dignity and courage, agreed. He allowed Porus to remain as ruler under his broader authority, and even gave more lands into his care. This choice, born from respect, showed once again that Alexander did not only seek to destroy, he sought to gather and reshape. Yet even as he won this new ally, the cost of such victories weighed more and more heavily on his men. The battle of Haida, the river they had crossed, the mud they had choked on, the sight of elephants crushing friends into the ground, these memories sank deep, while Alexander looked further east, dreaming of yet another great river, the Ganges, and kingdoms beyond. Many of his soldiers began to look inward and backward, their inner wish to stop, to turn homeward. Around evening fires, they counted the years they had been gone, the friends buried on foreign soil, the distance between them and the green hills of Macedon. They had followed their king across deserts. Their love for him was real, but it now lived beside an honest growing question. How much more could they give before nothing remained of themselves but tired bones and fading names? After Hydaspes, as the rain still fell from heavy clouds, and new plans were drawn in Alexander's tent, the river that truly mattered was not only the one that flowed past their camp. It was the river of reluctance. In the next part, we will stand with them at another great water, the Hyphasis, where Alexander's desire to go on meets the solid wall of his soldiers' will, and we will feel how a king who has never turned back learns for the first time to stop and listen to the... You are now listening to part 18. In this part, we will stand beside Alexander at the edge of the Hyphasis River, where his wish to go farther east meets the quiet but solid wall of his soldiers' exhaustion, where storms and distant kingdoms press from outside, loyal generals speak hard truths, and for the first time in his life, he learns to stop, to turn back, and to walk slowly into the long road home. After the hard victory at the height, rains fell often, turning the earth to thick mud. Strange trees and sounds filled the air, and the sky seemed lower somehow, as if leaning down over the tired men and their endless, dripping tents. Yet inside Alexander, the same old wish still burned, unsoftened by distance or time. He had heard of another great river further east, the Ganges. The thought that there might be more land, more kings, more unknown horizons still unseen by his eyes pulled at him like a tide. He imagined walking to the very end of the earth, or at least far enough that no one could ever say he had stopped too soon. That was his dream, bright and simple as a flame in his chest. But in the bodies and hearts of his soldiers, another current had become stronger. Their inner struggle had grown heavier with each step east, loyalty to their king on one side, a deep ache for home on the other. They remembered the first marches through Asia, the battles at the Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, the long siege of Tyre, the deserts, the cold highlands, the elephants at Hydaspes. Many of their friends were gone, lying in places that would never hear their native language again. Each new victory tasted less like glory. They did not hate Alexander. Many still loved him. But their love was now tired, like a loyal dog, too old to chase one more hunt. Outside the camp, the land itself seemed to join their quiet resistance. Reports came of powerful kingdoms beyond the Ephesus, with vast armies, even more elephants, and great cities. The monsoon rains beat down in long, dull sheets. Rivers were swollen, forests dense. Alexander heard these reports and saw the weather with his own eyes, yet the part of him that had never accepted any limit whispered that these were just more obstacles to overcome, more chances to prove that his will could shape even the farthest edges of the earth. He led his army onward until they reached the Ephesus River, broad and restless under a grey sky. Standing on its bank, he looked out toward the hidden east and felt his heart lean forward. He called his generals and officers together and spoke to them of the lands beyond, of the glory of reaching the Eastern Ocean, of how future generations would speak of their march as something unmatched. He reminded them of all they had already done, suggesting that one more great effort would complete the story forever. His words, as always, were strong and clear. But this time, instead, they stirred a different kind of sound in the hearts of those who listened. Many officers looked at one another with tired, troubled eyes. They respected his courage. They admired his greatness, but they also shared the same simple human limits as their men. Coenus, an older general who had marched with him for years, became the voice of that hidden current. Speaking with care and respect, he told Alexander what everyone else felt. They had done more than any army before them. Their bodies and spirits needed rest. Their hearts needed home. If the king pushed them farther, he might break not only their strength, but their love for him. Alexander listened, and inside him two forces collided. One was the old impatience, the part that had calmed Persepolis, crossed rivers under arrow fire, and refused to accept that any line on a map was a... The other was a quieter shape, made of all the years he had spent walking among these men, seeing their wounds, hearing their stories, knowing they were not just tools, but lives. At first, the impatient side won. He answered Coenus with sharp words, reminding him of honour. He withdrew to his tent, angry not only at his officers, but at the universe itself, for giving him men who were mortal, who grew tired and afraid, instead of sharing his restless hunger for more. Outside, the army felt the tension like a weight in the air. Messages slipped from tent to tent, carrying the question, would he force them on? Would he drag them deeper into lands they did not understand, against their heart's own limits? It was a heavy stillness, a refusal of the soul. They would fight if enemies came, they would defend themselves and their king, but they did not want to march further just to chase a dream that no longer felt like theirs. In that quiet stand, they became an outer force Alexander could not simply cut through. Alone in his tent, in the soft murmur of the... He remembered Aristotle's lessons about the nature of power, about how a ruler who forgets the limits of his people may find himself suddenly alone. He remembered the long years behind him, the sacrifices his soldiers had already made, the graves left on countless roads. He thought, too, of something he had always known, but rarely had to face so directly, that even kings are not gods, and even the strongest arm cannot stretch across the entire... Gradually, the stronger and wiser part of him rose above hurt pride. He stepped outside, called his men together, and spoke. His words this time were softer. He told them that he had wished to go on, that in his heart he could not help wanting to see the end of every road. But he had listened. He had weighed their hardships, their long service. To mark the edge of their journey, he ordered great altars and 12 towering monuments built along the Hyphasis, as if to carve in stone the fact that they had reached this far, a place no Macedonian or Greek army had ever seen. These altars were not just offerings to the gods. They were a quiet promise to the future, saying, "We came here. This was our limit, not of courage, but of human life." The men heard his decision, and along others simply sat down and stared at the rain, letting the news soak in. Their love for Alexander did not vanish. In fact, for many, it grew. A king who could finally bow, not to an enemy, but to the needs of his own people, was in some ways greater than the one who never yielded at all. Yet inside, Alexander felt a small sharp pain, like a splinter left under the skin. He had met for the first time a boundary. Still, he did not wallow in it. He turned his mind to the return, which would not be a simple walk home. There were lands to be organised, new cities to be founded, rivers to be sailed, and a great harsh desert waiting for him far to the south. He split his forces, sending some by sea and leading others overland along a path that would... As they began to move back from the Hyphasis, leaving the altars behind, like markers on the edge of a map, the world around them seemed the same: trees, rain, the soft rush of rivers. But the direction of their journey had changed. They were no longer pushing into the unknown. They were carrying it behind. In the next part, we will walk with Alexander and his men into the long, punishing road of return. Through the burning silence of the Gedrosian desert, the bitter cost of that choice, and the strange mixture of triumph and emptiness that grows in the heart of a man who has seen the edge of his own reach and must now... You are now listening to part 19. In this part, we will walk by Alexander's side on the long way home, through burning deserts and broken marches, through storms and quiet disappointments, and we will feel how his wish to turn all his conquests into a living, lasting order struggles against the limits of bodies, the harshness of the Gedrosian desert, the mistakes of command, the loyalty, and where the last chapter of his waking life quietly waits. When the army turned back from the Hyphasis, the direction of their march changed, but Alexander's desire did not simply fade. Now he wished, with a deep, steady fire, to weld together everything he had taken into one great whole, to bind Asia and Macedon, Greek and Persian, East and West, into a single shape that would not fall apart after he was gone. His men were tired, his newly taken lands were restless, and the paths home were full of danger, not just from enemies, but from his own choices. As they moved west and south, he decided on a bold plan: to send part of the forces and supplies by sea, with his admiral Nearchus, while he himself led a large part of the army overland through Gedrosian. He wished to prove that he could conquer not only kings and cities, but also the cruelest landscapes, and to open new routes that would tie his realms together. Inside, however, there was a small, honest doubt. Was this path necessary, or was it pride dressed up in the clothing of strategy? That question lingered quietly at the edge of his thoughts, even as he gave the orders. It was a wide, stony emptiness, beaten by a burning sun and whipped by dry winds that carried almost no mercy. The ground was rough, water was scarce, and shade was a rare gift. As the days stretched on, the army's pace slowed. Lips cracked, skins burned, and the steady rhythm of marching feet turned into a dragged, uneven shuffle. Outside, the enemies were not armies, but thirst, heat, and endless distance. Inside each man, they were not storming a city, not facing a great king, not defending their homes. They were simply walking through a giant oven at the edge of the world because their king had decided it must be so. Yet, even here, Alexander was not abandoned. Loyal officers moved up and down the lines, sharing the hardships, offering water, organising desperate searches for wells. He himself refused. When the army found a small supply of water, and someone brought him a helmet filled with it, he poured it out onto the sand in front of everyone, choosing to share their thirst rather than ease his own. That single act, quiet and simple, strengthened some hearts that were close to breaking. The men saw that whatever decisions he had made to bring them here, he did not float above their suffering. He walked in it with them. But even shared pain does not erase. Animals died, wagons broke, and some soldiers simply dropped where they stood, unable to take one more step. The column grew thinner and more hollow each day, like a long shadow stretched too far. At night, when the heat finally loosened its grip and the sky opened in a wide, star-filled bowl, he had crossed seas and broken armies, but here, among the dunes and stones, he could not command the sand to give water or the air to soften. In those hours, his inner struggle grew sharper. He wanted to believe that all this was part of a larger purpose, that the suffering would one day make sense inside the story of a united world. Yet another part of him, that awareness, though he did not speak it, left a faint bruise on his pride. At last, after weeks of slow, punishing advance, the worst of the desert ended. The army stumbled out of Gedrosia thinner, angrier, but still alive. They reached more fertile regions where food and water came more easily, and for a time Alexander met Nearchus again and heard the hardships of the sea journey, the storms, the uncertainty of strange coasts, the hunger and fear on rolling waves. Both routes had been brutal in their own way. The cost of his plan lay visible before him, in tired faces and missing names. From there, the road turned gradually toward more familiar lands, through Persia's heart. As they drew nearer to the centre again, Alexander's old wish to knit his empire together grew stronger and more urgent. He organised mass marriages at Susa, joining many of his officers to noble Persian women, as he himself had joined Roxana before. He hoped that shared families would mean shared futures, that children born of these unions would see no sharp line between Macedonian and Persian. But the inner resistance of his own people others felt forced into them, their hearts still tied to distant villages and customs. Alexander was trying to build a mixed world in his mind, but in real hearts, change moved more slowly, torn between pride and practicality. He also began training groups of Persian youths in Macedonian fighting styles, equipping them as soldiers in his army. To him, it was wise and fair. To some of his old companions, old officers who had marched from Macedon noticed their king dressing more often in Eastern robes, adopting Persian manners of court, expecting rituals of respect that felt strange to rough plain warriors. Inside Alexander, there was no simple betrayal. He still loved his old comrades, still valued their courage, but he had grown beyond the small frame of his early life. He saw himself as a ruler of a vast, many-faced world, and to embody that, the price of that vision was a widening gap between him and some of the men who had carried him this far. On the outside, that tension sometimes burst into harsh acts. On the return journey, when some units mutinied or showed open resistance, Alexander responded with sharp punishment. even executing certain officers he believed were plotting. Or the most painful of such moments had already come earlier, with the death of his old companion Clytus in a drunken quarrel, and with the trial of Callisthenes. But now, as he moved back toward Babylon, those earlier wounds throbbed again in his memory. He had become, in some eyes, not only a brilliant leader, but a man whose greatness also cast deep, dangerous shadows. Hephaestion, as long as he lived, stayed near, helping to ease tensions where he could, sharing the heavy silence of late nights when Alexander's mind would not rest. Other friends, both Macedonian and Eastern, believed in his vision of a blended empire and worked patiently to make it real. They were his inner circle of support, the ones who still saw not only his flaws, but also the softer parts of his nature. As the army finally drew close to Babylon, the city rose from the plain like a wide, shining bowl of life. Rivers, gardens, towers, and busy streets. To Alexander, it seemed the best place to rule, from the centre of his many lands, a place where East and West could meet. But under this hopeful thought ran a faint unease. Signs and omens, interpreted by priests and seers, began to whisper. He heard these warnings, and as always, weighed them against his own will. He chose to enter anyway. He had built his life on moving forward, not turning aside for shadows. As he rode through Babylon's gates once more, the air filled with cheers and colours, offerings and songs. The people saw a victorious king returning, only a few eyes looking closely at the tired lines around his face and the deep distance in his gaze. He still made plans for new campaigns in Arabia, for deeper organisation of his empire, for roads, harbours, and administrations yet to be built. But the long, hard road through deserts and storms, through blood and regret, had carved invisible cracks in the stone of his strength. There, in Babylon's rich air, with the Euphrates sliding quietly by, the greatest general of his age stood between. In the next and final part, we will sit with him through those last nights in Babylon, as fever slowly unthreads his strength, as his companions gather around a bed instead of a map, as questions of succession and legacy rise, and as his name, no longer carried by his body, begins. You are now listening to part 20, the final part of this long, quiet. In this part, we will stay with Alexander in his last days in Babylon, as fever slowly narrows the world around him, as his wishes for more campaigns struggle with the limits of his failing body, as friends and generals gather at his bedside instead of on the battlefield, and as his empire, unable to fit into any one pair of hands, begins to crack into many pieces, while his name drifts softly forward into history, like a candle flame carried through the dark, full of river moisture and the smells of gardens, spices, and crowded streets. Alexander returned there, not as a tireless young prince, but as a man who had walked farther than almost anyone before him. His wish still stretched ahead. He dreamed of new campaigns into Arabia, of better roads across his lands, of a more perfect blending of East and West, of a world where his laws and ideas would. Plans lay on his tables, maps marked with fresh lines, lists of names for new governors and projects. From the outside, anyone looking at him might have thought he had many years left to carry out such dreams. The empire was large, the future seemed wide. But inside, perhaps it was illness brought by strange lands, perhaps the long strain of years of marching and sleepless nights, perhaps a wound the eye could not see. Whatever its cause, a small weakness took hold. It began as a simple discomfort, a tiredness he could not shake. He pushed through it, as he had always pushed through pain, telling himself his skin burned, his head ached, and the world around him seemed to blur at the edges. Inside, for the first time, He felt not just the fear of losing a battle, but the quieter, more personal fear of losing his own grip on life, while so much remained undone. Outside his chamber, Babylon continued to hum. Generals argued softly about positions and titles. Eastern nobles and Greek. The empire, so large and new, needed constant attention to hold its pieces together. This was the outer pressure pressing in. The knowledge that if Alexander stopped, even for a short time, ambitious men and restless regions might start to pull away from the centre. The fever did not care. Day by day, it grew worse. Alexander tried to continue his usual duties, receiving officers, giving orders, reviewing plans. He moved to his bed, meaning to rest for a short while, and found that the bed became his new battlefield. Sweat soaked his sheets, his throat grew dry, and his voice, once strong and clear on windy plains, sometimes broke into a hoarse whisper. Physicians came. They were his immediate allies now, and around them hovered his most loyal companions, who had once shielded him from spears and arrows, and now could not shield him from the enemy inside his own blood. In those close, hot hours, Alexander's inner struggle sharpened. One part of him still refused to accept limits. He thought about Arabia, about ships and mapping coasts, about tightening the bonds between his governors and cities. He told himself that another part, deeper and quieter, began to understand what his body was saying, that no man, however bold, can outrun the simple truth that life has an end. The realization did not come all at once. It crept in like a slow tide, covering one patch of sand at a time. As news of his illness spread, the mood in Babylon shifted. Generals, satraps, and guards gathered in anxious knots outside his chamber. They spoke in low voices about what might happen. His son by Roxana was not yet born. His half-brother was not considered strong enough by many. Under the surface of their concern for his health, another, less noble tension began to stir. The question of who would hold which piece of this vast shining realm if his hand let go. That was the outer storm gathering just beyond his walls. Inside, Alexander could feel it in the air even when he could not hear every word. He saw the lines. He understood that his illness was not just his own. It was the illness of the whole order he had built, because so much of that order depended on him alone. Yet in those days, he also felt love and loyalty very close. Hephaestion was already gone, but now other friends filled his room. Old companions from Macedon, Eastern nobles who had truly come to respect him, officers who had followed him from river to river and mountain to mountain. They stood at his bedside as if it were a low, simple throne, watching the man who had led them across the world struggle just to breathe evenly. As the fever worsened, his voice faded to the point where he could not address the army directly anymore. Soldiers, desperate for a sign, filed past his bed in long lines, aloud in a slow, steady stream. He lay there, unable to speak to each one, but he raised his eyes and moved his hand as much as he could, letting them see that he recognized. For many of those men who had seen him charge into the thick of battle, that faint gesture, a glance, a small movement of fingers, was more moving than any shouted order. It told them that, even at the edge of his strength, he was still trying to stand beside them in spirit. In the last days, when his speech returned briefly and then slipped away again, the most famous question came. Different stories would later be told about his answer, but one quiet, troubling phrase floated up through the fog of memory to the strongest. Whether the exact words were that or something close, the meaning was clear. He could not or would not name a single heir. Instead, he left behind a task that would tear at the loyalties of those who had loved him, to decide among themselves how to divide or hold together. That choice born out of weakness and perhaps a stubborn refusal to admit that any one man could truly replace him, became the turning point. His empire, which looked so solid on a map, had rested on a living bridge, his own mind, his own will. When that bridge began to crumble, cracks spread quickly. And then, in a quiet moment that no one could stop, the fever finally carried him beyond the greatest general of his time, the boy from Pella who had once stared at distant hills and wondered what lay beyond them, died in a foreign bed in Babylon, far from the home where he had first learned to walk. Outside, the city went on breathing, the river flowed, the gardens drank water, the sun rose and set as if nothing unique had happened at all. After his death, generals who had once fought shoulder to shoulder began to pull against one another, carving out kingdoms in Macedonia, Egypt, Asia, and beyond. Battles were fought not just against old enemies, but among friends, now turned rivals. The dream of one single, blended world under his rule faded into a more complicated reality of separate states, alliances, and conflicts. Yet not everything he built vanished. In the cities he had founded, Alexandria, and trade flowed along the roads he had opened. Ideas, like quiet travellers, moved from one region to another. Philosophies, sciences, stories. The shape of the world's thought changed in ways that would outlast any single throne. His military ideas, his daring marches, his blending of cultures, and his name, Alexander the Great, became less the name of a single man and more a story, told and retold in many lands, in many tongues, each time a little different, each time carrying a piece of the real youth from Pella and a piece of the dreams people needed him to represent. Now, as we come to the end of this long, gentle path together, picture one last scene. The palace in Babylon is quiet. The torches burned low. The murmurs of, in a high window, the night sky opens wide, the same sky that once hung over Macedon, over the Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, Tyre, Egypt, Bactria, and the rivers of India. Under that sky, the memory of Alexander is no longer a man pacing beside a map. It is more like a soft footprint pressed into the dust of history, fading, and somewhere far from palaces and thrones by a small fire, or in a quiet room like yours, someone closes their eyes and listens to this story, letting the clatter of armies turn into a distant murmur, letting the bright, sharp edges of conquest soften into a simple image, a young boy once looking out at distant hills, wondering how far the world might go. And then, after a very long walk, fine, now you can let the noise of empires drift away like distant waves, and if you wish, you may carry only one small calm thought with you into sleep, that even the greatest lives are made of ordinary breaths, slow steps and quiet questions beneath the stars.